Chapter 14 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary Oldman. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Chapter 14. Captain Willoughby Reappears. During the months of July and August, Ethne's apprehensions grew, and once, at all events, they found expression on her lips. "I am afraid," she said one morning, as she stood in the sunlight at an open window of Mrs. Adair's house upon a creek of the Salcombe estuary. In the room behind her, Mrs. Adair smiled quietly. "Of what? That some accident happened to Colonel Durrance yesterday in London?" "No," Ethne answered slowly, "not of that, for he is at this moment crossing the lawn towards us." Again Mrs. Adair smiled, but she did not raise her head from the book which she was reading, so that it might have been some passage in the book which so amused and pleased her. "I thought so," she said, but in so low a voice that the words barely reached Ethne's ears. They did not penetrate to her mind, for as she looked across the stone-flagged terrace and down the broad shallow flight of steps to the lawn, she asked abruptly, "Do you think he has any hope whatever that he will recover his sight?" The question had not occurred to Mrs. Adair before, and she gave to it now no importance in her thoughts. "Would he travel up to town so often to see his oculist if he had none?" she asked in reply. "Of course he hopes." "I'm afraid," said Ethne, and she turned with a sudden movement toward her friend. "Haven't you noticed how quick he has grown and is growing? Quick to interpret your silences, to infer what you do not say from what you do, to fill out your sentences, to make your movements the commentary of your words. Laura, haven't you noticed? At times I think the very corners of my mind are revealed to him. He reads me like a child's lesson book." "Yes," said Mrs. Adair, "you are at a disadvantage. You no longer have your face to screen your thoughts." "And his eyes no longer tell me anything at all," Ethne added. There was truth in both remarks. So long as Durrance had Ethne's face with its bright colour and her steady, frank, grey eyes visible before him, he could hardly weigh her intervals of silence and her movements against her spoken words with the detachment which was now possible to him. On the other hand, whereas before she had never been troubled by a doubt as to what he meant or wished or intended, now she was often in the dark. Durrance's blindness, in a word, had produced an effect entirely opposite to that which might have been expected. It had reversed their positions. Mrs. Adair, however, was more interested in Ethne's unusual burst of confidence. There was no doubt of it, she reflected. The girl, once remarkable for a quiet frankness of word and look, was declining into a creature of shifts and agitation. "There is something, then, to be concealed from him?" she asked quietly. "Yes." "Something rather important?" "Something which at all costs I must conceal," Ethne exclaimed, and was not sure, even while she spoke, that Durrance had not already found it out. She stepped over the threshold of the window onto the terrace. In front of her the lawn stretched to a hedge. On the far side of that hedge a couple of grass fields lifted and fell in gentle undulations, and beyond the fields she could see, amongst a cluster of trees, the smoke from the chimneys of Colonel Durrance's house. She stood for a little while hesitating upon the terrace. On the left the lawn ran down to a line of tall beeches and oaks which fringed the creek, but a broad space had been cleared to make a gap upon the bank, so that Ethne could see the sunlight on the water and the wooded slope on the farther side, and a sailing boat some way down the creek tacking slowly against the light. Ethne looked about her, as though she were summoning her resources and even composing her sentences ready for delivery to the man who was walking steadily towards her across the lawn. If there was hesitation upon her part, there was none at all, she noticed, on the part of the blind man. It seemed that Durrance's eyes looked in the path which his feet trod, and with the stick which he carried in his hand he switched at the blades of grass, like one that carries it from habit rather than for any use. Ethne descended the steps and advanced to meet him. She walked slowly, as if to a difficult encounter. But there was another who only waited an opportunity to engage in it with eagerness. For as Ethne descended the steps, Mrs. Adair suddenly dropped the book from which she had pretended to resume, and ran towards the window. Hidden by the drapery of the curtain, she looked out and watched. The smile was still upon her lips, but a fierce light had brightened in her eyes. Her face had the drawn look of hunger. Something which at all costs she must conceal, she said to herself, and she said it in a voice of exultation. There was contempt, too, in her tone. Contempt for Ethne Eustace, the woman of the open air who was afraid, who shrank from marriage with a blind man, and dreaded the restraint upon her freedom. It was that shrinking which Ethne had to conceal. Mrs. Adair had no doubt of it. "For my part, I am glad," she said, and she was fiercely glad that blindness had disabled Durrance. For if her opportunity ever came, as it seemed to her now more and more likely to come, blindness reserved him to her, as no man was ever reserved to any woman. So jealous was she of his every word and look that his dependence upon her would be the extreme of pleasure. She watched Ethne and Durrance meet on the lawn at the foot of the terrace steps. She saw them turn and walk side by side across the grass towards the creek. She noticed that Ethne seemed to plead, and in her heart she longed to overhear. And Ethne was pleading. "You saw your oculist yesterday?" she asked quickly, as soon as they met. "Well, what did he say?" Durrance shrugged his shoulders. "That one must wait. Only time can show whether a cure is possible or not," he answered, and then Ethne bent forward a little and scrutinized his face as though she doubted that he had spoken the truth. "But must you and I wait?" she asked. "Surely," he returned. "It would be wiser on all counts," and thereupon he asked her suddenly a question of which she did not see the drift. "It was Mrs. Adair, I imagine, who proposed this plan, that I should come home to Guessens, and that you should stay with her here across the fields?" Ethne was puzzled by the question, but she answered it directly and truthfully. "I was in great distress when I heard of your accident. I was so distressed that at the first I could not think what to do. I came to London and told Laura, since she is my friend, and this was her plan. Of course I welcomed it with my heart," and the note of pleading rang in her voice. She was asking Durrance to confirm her words, and he understood that. He turned towards her with a smile. "I know that very well, Ethne," he said gently. Ethne drew a breath of relief, and the anxiety passed for a little while from her face. "It was kind of Mrs. Adair," he resumed, "but it is rather hard on you, who would like to be back in your own country. I remember very well a sentence which Harry Feversham," he spoke the name quite carelessly, but paused just for a moment after he had spoken it. No expression upon his face showed that he had any intention in so pausing, but Ethne suspected one. He was listening, she suspected, for some movement of uneasiness, perhaps of pain, into which she might possibly be betrayed, but she made no movement. "A sentence which Harry Feversham spoke a long while since," he continued, "in London, just before I left London for Egypt. He was speaking of you, and he said, 'She is of her country and more of her county. I do not think she could be happy in any place which was not within reach of Donegal.' And when I remember that, it seems rather selfish that I should claim to keep you here at so much cost to you." "I was not thinking of that," Ethne exclaimed. "When I asked why we must wait, that makes me out most selfish. I was merely wondering why you preferred to wait. why you insist upon it. For, of course, although one hopes and prays with all one's soul that you will get your sight back, the fact of a cure can make no difference." She spoke slowly, and her voice again had a ring of pleading. This time Durrance did not confirm her words, and she repeated them with a greater emphasis. "It can make no difference." Durrance started like a man roused from an abstraction. "I beg your pardon, Ethne," he said. "I was thinking at the moment of Harry Feversham. There is something which I want you to tell me. You said a long time ago at Glenalla that you might one day bring yourself to tell me, and I should rather like to know now. You see, Harry Feversham was my friend. I want you to tell me what happened that night at Lennon House to break off your engagement, to send him away an outcast." Ethne was silent for a while, and then she said gently, "I would rather not. It is all over and done with. I don't want you to ask me ever." Durrance did not press for an answer in the slightest degree. "Very well," he said cheerily. "I won't ask you. It might hurt you to answer, and I don't want, of course, to cause you pain." "It's not on that account that I wish to say nothing," Ethne explained earnestly. She paused and chose her word. "It isn't that I am afraid of any pain, but what took place such a long while ago. I look upon Mr. Feversham as a man whom one has known well and who is now dead." They were walking towards the wide gap in the line of trees upon the bank of the creek, and as Ethne spoke she raised her eyes from the ground. She saw that the little boat which she had noticed tacking up the creek while she hesitated upon the terrace had run its nose into the shore. The sail had been lowered, the little pole mast stuck up above the grass bank of the garden, and upon the bank itself a man was standing and staring vaguely towards the house as though not very sure of his ground. "A stranger has landed from the creek," she said. "He looks as if he had lost his way. I will go on and put him right." She ran forward as she spoke, seizing upon the stranger's presence as a means of relief, even if the relief was only to last a minute. Such relief might be felt, she imagined, by a witness in a court when the judge rises for his half hour at lunch time. For the close of an interview with Durrance left her continually with the sense that she had just stepped down from a witness box where she had been subjected to a cross-examination so deft that she could not quite clearly perceive its tendency, although from the beginning she suspected it. The stranger at the same time advanced to her. He was a man of the middle size, with a short snub nose, a pair of vacuous, protruding brown eyes, and a moustache of some ferocity. He lifted his hat from his head and disclosed a round forehead which was going bald. "I have sailed down from Kingsbridge," he said, "but I have never been in this part of the world before. Can you tell me if this house is called the Pool?" "Yes, and you will find Mrs. Adair if you go up the steps on to the terrace," said Ethne. "I came to see Miss Eustace." Ethne turned back to him with surprise. "I am Miss Eustace." The stranger contemplated her in silence. "So I thought." He twirled first one moustache and then the other before he spoke again. "I have had some trouble to find you, Miss Eustace. I went all the way to Glenalla for nothing. Rather hard on a man whose leave is short." "I am sorry," said Ethne with a smile. "But why have you been put to this trouble?" Again the stranger curled a moustache. Again his eyes dwelt vacantly upon her before he spoke. "You have forgotten my name, no doubt, by this time." "I do not think that I have ever heard it," she answered. "Ah, yes, you have. Believe me, you heard it 5 years ago. I am Captain Willoughby." Ethne drew sharply back. The bright colour paled in her cheeks. Her lips set in a firm line, and her eyes grew up very hard. She glowered at him silently. Captain Willoughby was not in the least degree decomposed. He took his time to speak, and when he did it was rather with the air of a man forgiving a breach of manners than of one making his excuses. "I can quite understand that you do not welcome me, Miss Eustace. but none of us could foresee that you would be present when the 3 white feathers came into Feversham's hands." Ethne swept the explanation aside. "How do you know I was present?" she asked. "Feversham told me." "You have seen him?" The cry leaped loudly from her lips. It was just a throb of the heart made vocal. It startled Ethne as much as it surprised Captain Willoughby. She had schooled herself to omit Harry Feversham from her thoughts, and to obliterate him from her affections, and the cry showed to her how incompletely she had succeeded. Only a few minutes since she had spoken of him as one whom she looked upon as dead, and she had believed that she spoke the truth. "You have actually seen him?" she repeated in a wondering voice. She gazed at her stolid companion with envy. "You have spoken to him, and he to you? When?" "A year ago at Suakin. Else why should I be here?" The question came as a shock to Ethne. She did not guess the correct answer. She was not, indeed, sufficiently mistress of herself to speculate upon any answer, but she dreaded it, whatever it might be. "Yes," she said slowly and almost reluctantly. "After all, why are you here?" Willoughby took a letter case from his breast, opened it with deliberation, and shook out from one of its pockets into the palm of his hand a tiny soiled white feather. He held it out to Ethne. "I have come to give you this." Ethne did not take it. In fact, she positively shrank from it. "Why?" she asked unsteadily. 3 white feathers, 3 separate accusations of cowardice, were sent to Feversham by 3 separate men. This is actually one of those feathers which were forwarded from his lodgings to Ramelton 5 years ago. I am one of the 3 men who sent them. I have come to tell you that I withdraw my accusation. I take my feather back." "And you bring it to me?" "He asked me to." Ethne took the feather in her palm, a thing in itself so light and fragile and yet so momentous as a symbol, and the trees and the garden began to whirl suddenly about her. She was aware that Captain Willoughby was speaking, but his voice had grown extraordinarily distant and thin, so that she was annoyed, since she wished very much to hear all that he had to say. She felt very cold, even upon that August day of sunlight. But the presence of Captain Willoughby, one of the 3 men whom she never would forgive, helped her to command herself. She would give no exhibition of weakness before any one of the detested 3, and with an effort she recovered herself when she was on the very point of swooning. "Come," she said, "I will hear your story. Your news was rather a shock to me. Even now I do not quite understand." She led the way from the open space to a little plot of grass above the creek. On 3 sides thick hedges enclosed it. At the back rose the tall elms and poplars. In front the water flashed and broke in ripples, and beyond the water the trees rose again and were overtopped by sloping meadows. A gap in the hedge made an entrance into this enclosure, and a garden seat stood in the centre of the grass. "Now," Ethne said, as she motioned to Captain Willoughby to take a seat at her side, "you will take your time, perhaps. You will forget nothing, even his words, if you remember them. I shall thank you for his words." She held that white feather clenched in her hand. Somehow Harry Feversham had redeemed his honour. Somehow she had been unjust to him, and she was to learn how. She was in no hurry. She did not even feel one pang of remorse that she had been unjust. Remorse, no doubt, would come afterwards. At present the mere knowledge that she had been unjust was too great a happiness to admit of abatement. She opened her hand and looked at the feather, and as she looked, memories sternly repressed for so long, regrets which she had thought stifled quite out of life, longings which had grown strange, filled all her thoughts. The Devonshire meadows were about her. The salt of the sea was in the air, but she was back again at the mist of that one season at Dublin during a spring 5 years ago, before the feathers came to Ramelton. Willoughby began to tell his story, and almost at once even the memory of that season vanished. Ethne was in the most English of countries, the county of Plymouth and Dartmouth and Brixton and the Start, where the red cliffs of its coastline speak perpetually of dead centuries, so that one cannot put into any harbour without some thought of the Spanish Main and of the little barques and pinnaces which had ventured manfully out on their long voyages with the tide. Up this very creek the clink of the shipbuilders' hammers had rung, and the soil upon its banks was vigorous with the memories of British soldiers. But Ethne had no thought for these associations. The countryside was a shifting mist before her eyes, which now and then let through a glimpse of that strange wide country in the east of which Durrance had so often told her. The only trees which she saw were the stunted mimosas of the desert. The only cliffs, the sharp pyramidal black rocks rising abruptly from its surface. It was part of the irony of her position that she was able so much more completely to appreciate the trials which one lover of hers had undergone through the confidences which had been made to her by the other. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Craig. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Chapter 15. The Story of the First Feather. "I will not interrupt you," said Ethne, as Willoughby took his seat beside her, and he had barely spoken a score of words before she broke that promise. "I am Deputy Governor of Suakin," he began. "My chief was on leave in May. You are fortunate enough not to know Suakin, Miss Eustace, particularly in May. No white woman can live in that town. It has a sodden, intolerable heat peculiar to itself. The air is heavy with brine. You can't sleep at night for its oppression. Well, I was sitting in the veranda on the first floor of the palace about 10 o'clock at night, looking out over the harbour and the distillation works, and wondering whether it was worthwhile to go to bed at all, when a servant told me that the man, who refused to give his name, wished particularly to see me. The man was Feversham. There was only a lamp burning in the veranda, and the night was dark, so that I did not recognize him until he was close to me. At once Ethne interrupted. "How did he look?" Willoughby wrinkled his forehead and opened his eyes wide. "Really, I do not know," he said doubtfully. "Much like other men, I suppose, who have been a year or two in the Sudan. A trifle overtrained and that sort of thing." "Never mind," said Ethne, with a sigh of disappointment. For 5 years she had heard no word of Harry Feversham. She fairly hungered for news of him, for the sound of his habitual phrases, for the description of his familiar gestures. She had the woman's anxiety for his bodily health. She wished to know whether he had changed in face or figure, and, if so, how and in what measure. But she glanced at the obtuse, unobservant countenance of Captain Willoughby, and she understood that however much she craved these particulars, she must go without. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Will you go on?" "I asked him what he wanted," Willoughby resumed, "and why he had not sent in his name. You would not have seen me if I had," he replied, and he drew a packet of letters out of his pocket. Now those letters, Miss Eustace, had been written a long while ago by General Gordon in Khartoum. They had been carried down the Nile as far as Berber. But the day after they reached Berber, that town surrendered to the Mahdists. Abu Fatma, the messenger who carried them, hid them in the wall of the house of an Arab called Yusef, who sold rock salt in the marketplace. Abu was then thrown into prison on suspicion and escaped to Suakin. The letters remained hidden in that wall until Feversham recovered them. I looked over them and saw that they were of no value, and I asked Feversham bluntly why he, who had once not dared to accompany his regiment on active service, had risked death and torture to get them back. Standing upon that veranda, with the quiet pool of water in front of him, Feversham had told his story quietly and without exaggeration. He had related how he had fallen in with Abu Fatma at Suakim, how he had planned the recovery of the letters, how the two men had traveled together as far as Obak, and since Abu Fatma dared not go further, how he himself, driving his grey donkey, had gone on alone to Berber. He had not even concealed that access of panic which had loosened his joints when first he saw the low brown walls of the town and the towering date palms behind on the bank of the Nile, which had set him running and leaping across the empty desert in the sunlight, a marrowless thing of fear. He made, however, one omission. He said nothing of the hours which he had spent crouching upon the hot sand, with his coat drawn over his head, while he drew a woman's face toward him across the continents and seas, and nerved himself to endure by the look of sorrow which it wore. "He went down into Berber at the setting of the sun," said Captain Willoughby, and it was all that he had to say. It was enough, however, for Ethne Eustace. She drew a deep breath of relief. Her face softened. There came a light into her grey eyes, and a smile upon her lips. "He went down into Berber," she repeated softly, "and found that the old town had been destroyed by the orders of the Emir, and that a new one was building upon its southern confines," continued Willoughby. "All the landmarks by which Feversham was to know the house in which the letters were hidden had gone. The roofs had been torn off, the houses dismantled, the front walls carried away. Narrow alleys of crumbling 5 courts. That is how Feversham described the place, crossing this way and that, and gaping to the stars. Here and there perhaps a broken tower rose up, and the remnant of a rich man's house. But of any sign which could tell a man where the hut of Yusuf, who had once sold rock salt in the marketplace, had stood, there was no hope in those acres of crumbling mud. The foxes had already made their burrows there. The smile faded from Ethne's face, but she looked again at the white feather lying in her palm, and she laughed with a great contentment. It was yellow with the desert dust. It was a proof that in this story there was to be no word of failure. "Go on," she said. Willoughby related the dispatch of the Negro with the donkey to Abu Fatma at the wells of Obak. Feversham stayed for a fortnight in Berber, Willoughby continued, a week during which he came every morning to the well and waited for the return of the Negro from Obak, and a week during which that Negro searched for Yusuf, who had once sold rock salt in the marketplace. "I doubt, Miss Eustace, if you can realize, however hard you try, what that fortnight must have meant to Feversham. The anxiety, the danger, the continued expectation that a voice would bid him to halt, and a hand fall upon his shoulder, the urgent knowledge that if a hand fell, death would be the least part of his penalty. I imagine the town, a town of low houses and broad streets of sand, dug here and there into pits of mud wherewith to build the houses, and overhead the blistering sun and a hot shadowless sky. In no corner was there any darkness or concealment, and all day a crowd jostled and shouted up and down these streets, for that is the Mahdi's policy, to crowd the towns, so that all may be watched and every other man may be his neighbor's spy. Feversham dared not seek the shelter of a roof at night, for he dared not trust his tongue. He could buy his food each day at the booths, but he was afraid of any conversation. He slept at night in some corner of the old deserted town, in the acres of the ruined 5 courts. For the same reason he must not slink in the byways by day, lest anyone should question him about his business, nor listen on the chance of hearing Yusuf's name in the public places, lest other loiterers should joke with him and draw him into their talk. Nor dare he in the daylight prowl about those crumbled ruins. From sunrise to sunset he must go quickly up and down the streets of the town like a man bent upon urgent business, which permits of no delay. And that continued for a fortnight, Miss Eustace. A weary, trying life, don't you think? I wish I could tell you of it as vividly as he told me that night upon the balcony of the palace at Suakin. Ethne wished it too with all her heart. Harry Feversham had made his story very real that night to Captain Willoughby, so that even after the lapse of 15 months this unimaginative creature was sensible of a contrast and a deficiency in the manner of his narration. In front of us was the quiet harbor and the Red Sea. Above us the African stars. Feversham spoke in the quietest manner possible, but with a peculiar deliberation, and with his eyes fixed upon my face, as though he was forcing me to feel with him and to understand. Even when he lighted his cigar, he did not avert his eyes, for by this time I had given him a cigar and offered him a chair. I had really, I assure you, Miss Eustace. It was the first time in 4 years that he had sat with one of his equals, or indeed with any of his countrymen on a footing of equality. He told me so. I wish I could remember all that he told me. Willoughby stopped and cudgelled his brains helplessly. He gave up the effort in the end. Well, he resumed, after Feversham had skulked for a fortnight in Berber, the Negro discovered Yusef, no longer selling salt, but tending a small plantation of doura on the river's edge. From Yusef, Feversham obtained particulars enough to guide him to the house where the letters were concealed in the inner wall. But Yusef was no longer to be trusted. Possibly Feversham's accent betrayed him. The more likely conjecture is that Yusef took Feversham for a spy, and thought it wise to be beforehand and confess to Mohammed el-Khair, the emir, his own share in the concealment of the letters. That, however, is a mere conjecture. The important fact is this. On the same night Feversham went alone to Old Berber. Alone, said Ethne. Yes. He found the house fronting a narrow alley, and the 6th of the row. The front wall was destroyed, but the 2 side walls and the back wall still stood. 3 feet from the floor and 2 feet from the right-hand corner the letters were hidden in that inner wall. Feversham dug into the mud bricks with his knife. He made a hole wherein he could slip his hand. The wall was thick. He dug deep, stopping now and again to feel for the packet. At last his fingers clasped and drew it out. As he hid it in a fold of his jibbeh, the light of a lantern shone upon him from behind. Ethne started as though she had been trapped herself. Those acres of roofless 5 courts, with here and there a tower showing up against the sky, the lonely alleys, the dead silence here beneath the stars, the cries and the beating of drums and the glare of lights from the new town, Harry Feversham alone with the letters, with, and in a word, some portion of his honor redeemed, and finally the lantern flashing upon him in that solitary place. The scene itself and the progress of the incidents were so visible to Ethne at that moment that even with the feather in her open palm she could hardly bring herself to believe that Harry Feversham had escaped. "Well, well?" she asked. He was standing with his face to the wall. The light came from the alley behind him. He did not turn, but out of the corner of his eye he could see a fold of a white robe hanging motionless. He carefully secured the package, with a care, indeed, and a composure which astonished him even at that moment. The shock had strung him to a concentration and lucidity of thought unknown to him till then. His fingers were trembling, he remarked, as he tied the knots, but it was with excitement, and an excitement which did not flurry. His mind worked rapidly, but quite coolly, quite deliberately. He came to a perfectly definite conclusion as to what he must do. Every faculty which he possessed was extraordinarily clear, and at the same time extraordinarily still. He had his knife in his hand. He faced about suddenly and ran. There were 2 men waiting. Feversham ran at the man who held the lantern. He was aware of the point of a spear. He ducked and beat it aside with his left arm. He leaped forward and struck with his right. The Arab fell at his feet. The lantern was extinguished. Feversham sprang across the white-robed body and ran eastward, toward the open desert. But in no panic. He had never been so collected. He was followed by the 2nd soldier. He had foreseen that he would be followed. If he was to escape, it was indeed necessary that he should be. He turned a corner, crouched behind a wall, and as the Arab came running by, he leaped out upon his shoulders. And again, as he leaped, he struck. Captain Willoughby stopped at this point of his story and turned toward Ethne. He had something to say which perplexed and at the same time impressed him, and he spoke with a desire for an explanation. The strangest feature of those few fierce short minutes, he said, was that Feversham felt no fear. "I don't understand that, do you? From the first moment when the lantern shone upon him from behind, to the last when he turned his feet eastward and ran through the ruined alleys and broken walls toward the desert and the wells of Bobak, he felt no fear." This was the most mysterious part of Harry Feversham's story to Captain Willoughby. Here was a man who so shrank from the possibilities of battle that he must actually send in his papers rather than confront them, yet when he stood in dire and immediate peril he felt no fear. Captain Willoughby might well turn to Ethne for an explanation. There had been no mystery in it to Harry Feversham, but a great bitterness of spirit. He had sat on the veranda at Suakin, whittling away at the edge of Captain Willoughby's table with the very knife which he had used in Berber to dig out the letters, and which had proved so handy in a weapon, when the lantern shone out behind him, the one glimmering point of light in that vast acreage of ruin. Harry Feversham had kept it carefully uncleansed of blood. He had treasured it all through his flight across the 240-odd miles of the desert into Suakin. It was, next to the white feathers, the thing which he held most precious of his possessions, and not merely because it would serve as a corroboration of his story to Captain Willoughby, but because the weapon enabled him to believe and realize it himself. A brown clotted rust delved the whole length of the blade, and often during the first 2 days and nights of his flight, when he traveled alone, hiding and running and hiding again, with the dread of pursuit always at his heels, he had taken the knife from his breast and stared at it with incredulous eyes, and clutched it close to him like a thing of comfort. He had lost his way amongst the sandhills of Obak on the evening of the second day, and had wandered vainly with his small store of dates and water exhausted, until he had stumbled and lay prone, parched and famished and enfeebled, with the bitter knowledge that Abu Fatma and the wells were somewhere within a mile of the spot on which he lay. But even at that moment of exhaustion the knife had been a talisman and a help. He grasped the rough wooden handle, all too small for a Western hand, and he ran his fingers over the rough rust upon the blade, and the weapon spoke to him and bade him to take heart, since once he had been put to the test and had not failed. But long before he saw the white houses of Suakin, that feeling of elation vanished, and the knife became an emblem of the vain tortures of his boyhood, and the miserable folly which culminated in his resignation of his commission. He understood now the words which Lieutenant Such had spoken in the grill-room of the Criterion restaurant, when citing Hamlet as his example. The thing which he saw, which he thought over, which he imagined in the act and in the consequences, that he shrank from. Yet when the moment of action comes sharp and immediate, does he fail? And remembering these words, Harry Feversham sat one May night, 4 years afterward, in Captain Willoughby's veranda, whittling away at the table with his knife, and saying over and over again, in a bitter, savage voice, "It was an illusion, but an illusion which caused a great deal of suffering to a woman I would have shielded from suffering. But I am well paid for it, for it has wrecked my life besides." Captain Willoughby could not understand, any more than General Feversham could have understood, or than Ethne had. But Willoughby could at all events remember and repeat, and Ethne had grown by 5 years of unhappiness since the night when Harry Feversham, in the little room off the hall at Lennon House, had told her of his upbringing, of the loss of his mother, of the impassable gulf between his father and himself, and of the fear of disgrace which had haunted his nights and disfigured the world for him by day. "Yes, it was an illusion," she cried. "I understand. I might have understood a long while since, but I would not. When those feathers came he told me why they were sent, quite simply, with his eyes on mine. When my father knew of them, he waited quite steadily and faced my father." There was other evidence of the like kind not within Ethne's knowledge. Harry Feversham had journeyed down to Broad Place in Surrey, and made his confession no less unflinchingly to the old general. But Ethne knew enough. It was the possibility of cowardice from which he shrank, not the possibility of hurt, she exclaimed. If only one had been a little older, a little less sure about things, a little less narrow. I should have listened. I should have understood. At all events, I should not, I think, have been cruel. Not for the first time did remorse for that fourth feather which she had added to the three seize upon her. She sat now crushed by it into silence. Captain Willoughby, however, was a stubborn man, unwilling upon any occasion to admit an error. He saw that Ethne's remorse by implication condemned himself, and that he was not prepared to suffer. Yes, but these fine distinctions are a little too elusive for practical purposes, he said. You can't run the world on fine distinctions, so I cannot bring myself to believe that we three men were at all to blame, and if we were not, you of all people can have no reason for self-reproach. Ethne did not consider what he precisely meant by the last reference to herself, for as he leaned complacently back in his chair, anger against him flamed suddenly hot in her. Occupied by his story, she had ceased to take stock of the storyteller. Now that he had ended, she looked him over from head to foot. An obstinate stupidity was the mark of the man to her eye. How dare he sit in judgment upon the meanest of his fellows, let alone Harry Feversham? She asked, and in the same moment recollected that she herself had endorsed his judgment. Shame tingled through all her blood. She sat with her lips set, keeping Willoughby under watch from the corners of her eyes, and waiting to pounce savagely the moment he opened his lips. There had been noticeable throughout his narrative a manner of condescension towards Feversham. Let him use it again, thought Ethne. But Captain Willoughby said nothing at all, and Ethne herself broke the silence. "Who of you three first thought of sending the feathers?" she asked aggressively. "Not you?" "No, I think it was Trench," he replied. "Ah, Trench!" Ethne exclaimed. She struck one clenched hand, the hand which held the feather, viciously into the palm of the other. "I'll remember that name." "But I share his responsibility," Willoughby assured her. "I do not shrink from it at all. I regret very much that we caused you pain and annoyance, but I do not acknowledge to any mistake in this matter. I take my feather back now, and I annul my accusation. But that is your doing." "Mine?" asked Ethne. "What do you mean?" Captain Willoughby turned with surprise to his companion. A man may live in the Soudan and even yet not be wholly ignorant of women and their great quality of forgiveness. "You gave the feathers back to Feversham in order that he might redeem his honor. That is evident." Ethne sprang to her feet before Captain Willoughby had come to the end of his sentence, and stood a little in front of him with her face averted and in an attitude remarkably still. Willoughby, in his ignorance, like many another stupid man before him, had struck with a shrewdness and a vigor which he could never have compassed by the use of his wits. He had pointed out abruptly and suddenly to Ethne a way which she might have taken and had not, and her remorse warned her very clearly that it was the way which she ought to have taken. But she could rise to the heights. She did not seek to justify herself in her own eyes, nor would she allow Willoughby to continue in his misconception. She recognized that here she had failed in charity and justice, and she was glad that she had failed, since her failure had been the opportunity of greatness to Harry Feversham. "Will you repeat what you said?" she asked in a low voice, "and ever so slowly, please." "You gave the feathers back into Feversham's hand. He told you that himself?" "Yes," and Willoughby resumed. "In order that he might by his subsequent bravery compel the men who sent them to take them back, and so redeem his honor." "He did not tell you that?" "No, I guessed it. You see, Feversham's disgrace was, on the face of it, impossible to retrieve. The opportunity might never have occurred. It was not likely to occur. As things happened, Feversham still waited for 3 years in the bazaar at Suakin before it did. No, Miss Eustace, It needed a woman's faith to conceive that plan, a woman's encouragement to keep the man who undertook it to his work. Ethne laughed and turned back to him. Her face was tender with pride, and more than tender. Pride seemed in some strange way to hallow her, to give an unimagined benignance to her eyes, an unearthly brightness to the smile upon her lips and the color upon her cheeks, so that Willoughby, looking at her, was carried out of himself. "Yes," he cried, "you are the woman to plan this redemption." Ethne laughed again, and very happily. "Did he tell you of the fourth white feather?" she asked. "No." "I shall tell you the truth," she said, and she resumed her seat. "The plan was of his devising from first to last, nor did I encourage him to its execution, for until today I never heard a word of it. Since the night of that dance in Donegal I have had no message from Mr. Feversham, and no news of him. I told him to take up those 3 feathers because they were his, and I wished to show him that I agreed with the accusations of which they were the symbols. That seems cruel, but I did more. I snapped a 4th white feather from my fan, and gave him that to carry away too. It is only fair that you should know. I wanted to make an end, for ever and ever, not only of my acquaintanceship with him, but of every kindly thought he might keep of me, of every kindly thought I might keep of him. I wanted to be sure myself, and I wanted him to be sure, that we should always be strangers, now and afterwards." And the last words she spoke in a whisper. Captain Willoughby did not understand what she meant by them. It is possible that only Lieutenant Such and Harry Feversham himself would have understood. "I was sad and sorry enough when I had done it," she resumed. Indeed, I think I have always been sorry since. I think that I have never at any minute during these 5 years quite forgotten that 4th white feather and the quiet air of dignity with which he took it. But today I'm glad." And her voice, though low, rang rich with the fullness of her pride. "Oh, very glad. For this was his thought, his deed. They are both all his, as I would have them be. I had no share, and of that I am very proud. He needed no woman's faith, no woman's encouragement. Yet he sent this back to you," said Willoughby, pointing in some perplexity to the feather which Ethne held. "Yes," she said, "yes. He knew that I should be glad to know." And suddenly she held it close to her breast. Thus she sat for a while with her eyes shining, until Willoughby rose to his feet and pointed to the gap in the hedge by which they had entered the enclosure. "By Jove, Jack Durrance!" he exclaimed. Durrance was standing in the gap, which was the only means of entering or going out. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary Oldman. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Chapter 16. Captain Willoughby retires. Ethne had entirely forgotten even Colonel Durrance's existence. From the moment when Captain Willoughby had put that little soiled feather, which had once been white and was now yellow, into her hand, she had no thought for any one but Harry Feversham. She had carried Willoughby into that enclosure, and his story had absorbed her and kept her memory on the rack as she filled out with this or that recollected details of Harry's gestures, or voice, or looks, the deficiencies in her companion's narrative. She had been swept away from that August garden of sunlight and coloured flowers, and those 5 most weary years, during which she had held her head high and greeted the world with a smile of courage, were blotted from her existence. How weary they had been, perhaps she never knew, until she raised her head and saw Durrance at the entrance of the hedge. "Hush!" she said to Willoughby, and her face paled and her eyes shut tight for a moment with a spasm of pain. but she had no time to spare for any indulgence of her feelings. Her few minutes' talk with Captain Willoughby had been a holiday, but the holiday was over. She must take up again the responsibilities with which those 5 years had charged her, and at once. If she could not accomplish that hard task of forgetting, and she now knew very well that she never would accomplish it, she must do the next best thing, and give no sign that she had not forgotten. Durrance must continue to believe that she brought more than friendship into the marriage account. He stood at the very entrance to the enclosure. He advanced into it. He was so quick to guess. It was not wise that he should meet Captain Willoughby, or even know of his coming. Ethne looked about her for an escape, knowing very well that she would look in vain. The creek was in front of them, and 3 walls of high thick hedge girt them in behind and at the sides. There was but one entrance to this enclosure, and Durrance himself barred the path to it. "Keep still," she said in a whisper. "You know him?" "Of course. We were together for 3 years at Suakin. I heard that he had gone blind. I am glad to know that it is not true." This he said, noticing the freedom of Durrance's gait. "Speak lower," returned Ethne. "It is true. He is blind. One would never have thought it. Consolation seems so futile. What can I say to him?" "Say nothing." Durrance was still standing just within the enclosure, and, as it seemed, looking straight towards the 2 people sitting on the bench. "Ethne," he said, rather than called, and the quiet, unquestioning voice made the illusion that he saw extraordinarily complete. "It's impossible that he is blind," said Willoughby. "He sees us." "He sees nothing." Again Durrance called "Ethne," but now in a louder voice, and a voice of doubt. "Do you hear?" "He is not sure," whispered Ethne. "Keep very still." "Why?" "He must not know you are here, and lest Willoughby should move." She caught his arm tight in her hand. Willoughby did not pursue his inquiries. Ethne's manner constrained him to silence. She sat very still, as she wished him to sit, and in a queer, huddled attitude. She was even holding her breath. She was staring at Durrance with a great fear in her eyes. Her face was strained forward, and not a muscle of it moved, so that Willoughby, as he looked at her, was conscious of a certain excitement which grew on him for no reason but her remarkable apprehension. He began unaccountably himself to fear lest he and she should be discovered. "He is coming towards us," he whispered. "Not a word, not a movement." "Ethne!" Durrance cried again. He advanced further into the enclosure and towards the seat. Ethne and Captain Willoughby sat rigid, watching him with their eyes. He passed in front of the bench and stopped, actually facing them. "Surely," thought Willoughby, "he sees." His eyes were upon them. He stood easily, as though he were about to speak. Even Ethne, though she very well knew that he did not see, began to doubt her knowledge. "Ethne," he said again, and this time in the quiet voice which he had first used. But since again no answer came, he shrugged his shoulders and turned towards the creek. His back was towards them now, but Ethne's experience had taught her to appreciate almost indefinable signs in his bearing, since nowadays his face showed her so little. Something in his attitude, in the poise of his head, even in the carelessness with which he swung his stick, told her that he was listening, and listening with all his might. Her grasp tightened on Willoughby's arm. Thus they remained for the space of a minute, and then Durrance turned suddenly and took a quick step towards the seat. Ethne, however, by this time knew the man and his ingenuities. She was prepared for some such unexpected movement. She did not stir. There was not audible the merest rustle of a skirt, and her grip still constrained Willoughby. "I wonder where in the world she can be," said Durrance to himself aloud, and he walked back and out of the enclosure. Ethne did not free Captain Willoughby's arm until Durrance had disappeared from sight. "That was a close shave," Willoughby said, when at last he was allowed to speak. "Suppose that Durrance had sat down on the top of us?" "Why suppose, since he did not?" Ethne asked calmly. "You have told me everything?" "So far as I remember." "And all that you have told me happened in the spring?" "The spring of last year," said Willoughby. "Yes, I want to ask you a question. Why did you not bring this feather to me last summer?" "Last year my leave was short. I spent it in the hills north of Suakin, after ibex." "I see," Ethne said quietly. "I hope you had good sport." "It wasn't bad." Last summer Ethne had been free. If Willoughby had come home with his good news instead of shooting ibex on Jebel Araft, it would have made all the difference in her life, and the cry was loud at her heart, "Why didn't you come?" But outwardly she gave no sign of the irreparable harm which Willoughby's delay had brought about. She had the self-command of a woman who had been sorely tried, and she spoke so unconcernedly that Willoughby believed her questions, prompted by the merest curiosity. "You might have written," she suggested. Feversham did not suggest that there was any hurry. It would have been a long and difficult matter to explain in a letter. "He asked me to go to you when I had an opportunity, and I had no opportunity before. To tell the truth, I thought it was very likely that I might find Feversham had come back before me." "Oh no," returned Ethne. "There could be no possibility of that. The other two feathers still remain to be redeemed before he will ask me to take back mine." Willoughby shook his head. "Feversham can never persuade Castleton and Trench to cancel their accusations as he persuaded me." "Why not?" "Major Castleton was killed when the square was broken at Tamai." "Killed!" cried Ethne, and she laughed in a short and satisfied way. Willoughby turned and stared at her, disbelieving the evidence of his ears, but her face showed him quite clearly that she was thoroughly pleased. Ethne was a Celt, and she had the Celtic feeling that death was not a very important matter. She could hate too, and she could be hard as iron to the men she hated, and these three men she hated exceedingly. It was true that she had agreed with them, that she had given a feather, the fourth feather, to Harry Feversham, just to show that she agreed, but she did not trouble her head about that. She was very glad to hear that Major Castleton was out of the world and done with. "And Colonel Trench too?" she said. "No," Willoughby answered. "You are disappointed, but he is even worse off than that. He was captured when engaged on a reconnaissance. He is now a prisoner in Omdurman." "Ah," said Ethne. "I don't think you can have any idea," said Willoughby severely, "of what captivity in Omdurman implies. If you had, however much you disliked the captive, you would feel some pity." "Not I," said Ethne stubbornly. "I will tell you something of what it does imply." "No, I don't wish to hear of Colonel Trench. Besides, you must go. I want you to tell me one thing first," said she, as she rose from her seat. "What became of Mr. Feversham after he had given you that feather?" "I told him that he had done everything which could be reasonably expected, and he accepted my advice, for he went on board the first steamer which touched at Suakin on its way to Suez, and so left the Soudan. I must find out where he is. He must come back. Did he need money?" "No, he still drew his allowance from his father. He told me that he had more than enough." "I am glad of that," said Ethne, and she bade Willoughby wait within the enclosure until she returned, and went out by herself to see that the way was clear. The garden was quite empty. Durrance had disappeared from it, and the great stone terrace of the house, and the house itself with its striped sunblinds, looked a place of sleep. It was getting towards 1 o'clock, and the very birds were quiet among the trees. Indeed, the quietude of the garden struck upon Ethne's senses as something almost strange. Only the bees hummed drowsily about the flower beds, and the voice of a lad was heard calling from the slopes of meadow on the far side of the creek. She returned to Captain Willoughby. "You can go now," she said. "I cannot pretend friendship for you, Captain Willoughby, but it was kind of you to find me out and tell me your story. You are going back at once to Kingsbridge?" "I hope so, for I do not wish Colonel Durrance to know of your visit or anything of what you have told me." "Durrance was a friend of Feversham's, his great friend," Willoughby objected. "He is quite unaware that any feathers were sent to Mr. Feversham," so there is no need he should be informed that one of them has been taken back." Ethne answered, "He does not know why my engagement to Mr. Feversham was broken off. I do not wish him to know. Your story would enlighten him, and he must not be enlightened." "Why?" asked Willoughby. "He was obstinate by nature, and he meant to have the reason for silence before he promised to keep it." Ethne gave it to him at once very simply. "I am engaged to Colonel Durrance," she said. It was her fear that Durrance already suspected that no stronger feeling than friendship attached her to him. If once he heard that the fault which broke her engagement to Harry Feversham had been most bravely atoned, there could be no doubt as to the course which he would insist upon pursuing. He would strip himself of her, the one thing left to him, and that she was stubbornly determined he should not do. She was bound to him in honour, and it would be a poor way of manifesting her joy that Harry Feversham had redeemed his honour if she straightway sacrificed her own. Captain Willoughby pursed his lips and whistled. "Engaged to Jack Durrance!" he exclaimed. "Then I seem to have wasted my time in bringing you that feather," and he pointed towards it. She was holding it in her open hand, and she drew her hand sharply away, as though she feared for a moment that he meant to rob her of it. "I am most grateful for it," she returned. "It's a bit of a muddle, isn't it?" Willoughby remarked. "It seems a little tough on Feversham, perhaps. It's a little rough on Jack Durrance, too, when you come to think of it." Then he looked at Ethne. He noticed her careful handling of the feather. He remembered something of the glowing look with which she had listened to his story, something of the eager tones in which she had put her question, and he added, "I shouldn't wonder if it was rather rough on you too, Miss Eustace." Ethne did not answer him, and they walked together out of the enclosure towards the spot where Willoughby had moored his boat. She had hurried him down the bank to the water's edge, intent that he should sail away unperceived. But Ethne had counted without Mrs. Adair, who all that morning had seen much in Ethne's movements to interest her. From the drawing-room window she had watched Ethne and Durrance meet at the foot of the terrace steps. She had seen them walk together towards the estuary. She had noticed Willoughby's boat as it ran aground in the wide gap between the trees. She had seen a man disembark and Ethne go forward to meet him. Mrs. Adair was not the woman to leave her post of observation at such a moment, and from the cover of the curtains she continued to watch with all the curiosity of a woman in a village who draws down the blind, that unobserved she may get a better peep at the stranger passing down the street. Ethne and the man from the boat turned away and disappeared among the trees, leaving Durrance forgotten and alone. Mrs. Adair thought at once of that enclosure at the water's edge. The conversation lasted for some while, and since the couple did not promptly reappear, a question flashed into her mind. Could the stranger be Harry Feversham? Ethne had no friends in this part of the world. The question pressed upon Mrs. Adair. She longed for an answer, and of course for that particular answer which would convict Ethne Eustace of duplicity. Her interest grew into excitement when she saw Durrance, tired of waiting, follow upon Ethne's steps. But what came after was to interest her still more. Durrance reappeared to her supplies alone, and came straight to the house, up the terrace into the drawing-room. "Have you seen Ethne?" he asked. "Is she not in the little garden by the water?" Mrs. Adair asked. "No, I went into it and called to her. It was empty." "Indeed," said Mrs. Adair. "Then I don't know where she is." "Are you going?" "Yes, home." Mrs. Adair made no effort to detain him at that moment. "Perhaps you will come in and dine to night. 8 o'clock." "Thanks very much. I shall be pleased," said Durrance, but he did not immediately go. He stood by the window idly swinging to and fro the tassel of the blind. "I did not know until to day that it was your plan that I should come home and Ethne stay with you until I found out whether a cure was likely or possible. It was very kind of you, Mrs. Adair, and I am grateful." It was a natural plan to propose as soon as I heard of your ill luck." "And when was that?" he asked unconcernedly. "The day after Calder's telegram reached her from Wadi Halfa, I suppose." Mrs. Adair was not deceived by his attitude of carelessness. She realized that his expression of gratitude had deliberately led up to this question. "Oh, so you know of that telegram," she said. "I thought you did not." For Ethne had asked her not to mention it on the very day when Durrance returned to England. "Of course I knew it," he returned, and without waiting any longer for an answer he went out on to the terrace. Mrs. Adair dismissed for the moment the mystery of the telegram. She was occupied by a conjecture that in the little garden by the water's edge Durrance had stood and called aloud for Ethne, while within 12 yards of him, perhaps actually within his reach, she and someone else had kept very still and had given no answer. Her conjecture was soon proved true. She saw Ethne and her companion come out again on to the open lawn. Was it Feversham? She must have an answer to that question. She saw them descend the bank towards the boat, and, stepping from a window, ran. Thus it happened that as Willoughby rose from loosening the painter, he saw Mrs. Adair's disappointed eyes gazing into his. Mrs. Adair called to Ethne, who stood by Captain Willoughby, and came down to the bank to them. "I noticed you crossed the lawn from the drawing-room window," she said. "Yes," answered Ethne, and she said no more. Mrs. Adair, however, did not move away, and an awkward pause followed. Ethne was forced to give in. "I am talking to Captain Willoughby," and she turned to him. "You do not know Mrs. Adair, I think." "No," he replied as he raised his hat, "but I know Mrs. Adair very well by name. I know friends of yours, Mrs. Adair, Durrance, for instance, and of course I knew." A glance from Ethne brought him abruptly to a stop. He began vigorously to push the nose of his boat from the sand. "Of course what?" asked Mrs. Adair with a smile. "Of course I knew of you, Mrs. Adair." Mrs. Adair was quite clear that this was not what Willoughby had been on the point of saying when Ethne turned her eyes quietly upon him and cut him short. He was on the point of adding another name. "Captain Willoughby," she repeated to herself. Then she said, "You belong to Colonel Durrance's regiment, perhaps?" "No, I belong to the North Surrey," he answered. "Ah, Mr. Feversham's old regiment," said Mrs. Adair pleasantly. Captain Willoughby had fallen into a little trap with a guilelessness which provoked in her a desire for a closer acquaintance. Whatever Willoughby knew it would be easy to extract. Ethne, however, had disconcerting ways which at times left Mrs. Adair at a loss. She looked now straight into Mrs. Adair's eyes and said calmly, "Captain Willoughby and I have been talking of Mr. Feversham." At the same time she held out her hand to the captain. "Good bye," she said. Mrs. Adair hastily interrupted. "Colonel Durrance has gone home, but he dines with us tonight. I came out to tell you that, but I am glad that I came, for it gives me the opportunity to ask your friend to lunch with us if he will." Captain Willoughby, who already had one leg over the bow of his boat, withdrew it with alacrity. "It's awful good of you, Mrs. Adair," he began. "It is very kind indeed," Ethne continued, "but Captain Willoughby has reminded me that his leave is very short, and we have no right to detain him. Good bye." Captain Willoughby gazed with a vain appeal upon Miss Eustace. He had travelled all night from London. He had made the scantiest breakfast at Kingsbridge, and the notion of lunch appealed to him particularly at that moment. But her eyes rested on his with a quiet and inexorable command. He bowed, got ruefully into his boat, and pushed off from the shore. "It's a little rough on me too, perhaps, Miss Eustace," he said. Ethne laughed, and returned to the terrace with Mrs. Adair. Once or twice she opened the palm of her hand and disclosed to her companion's view a small white feather, at which she laughed again, and with a clear and rather low laugh. but she gave no explanation of Captain Willoughby's errand. Had she been in Mrs. Adair's place, she would not have expected one. It was her business, and only hers. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gary Oldman. The Musoline Overture. Mrs. Adair, on her side, asked for no explanations. She was naturally, behind her pale and placid countenance, a woman of a tortuous and intriguing mind. She preferred to look through a keyhole, even when she could walk straight in at the door, and knowledge which could be gained by a little manoeuvring was always more desirable and precious in her eyes than any information which a simple question would elicit. She avoided, indeed, the direct question on a perverted sort of principle, and she thought a day very well spent if at the close of it she had outwitted her companion into telling her spontaneously some trivial and unimportant piece of news which a straightforward request would have at once secured for her at breakfast time. Therefore, though she was mystified by the little white feather upon which Ethne seemed to set so much store, and wondered at the good news of Harry Feversham which Captain Willoughby had brought, and vainly puzzled her brain in conjecture as to what in the world could have happened on that night at Ramelton so many years ago, she betrayed nothing whatever of her perplexity all through lunch. On the contrary, she plied her guest with conversation upon indifferent topics. Mrs. Adair could be good company when she chose, and she chose now, but it was not to any purpose. "I don't believe that you hear a single word I am saying," she exclaimed. Ethne laughed and pleaded guilty. She betook herself to her room as soon as lunch was finished, and allowed herself an afternoon of solitude. Sitting at her window, she repeated slowly the story which Willoughby had told her that morning, and her heart thrilled to it as to the music divinely played. The regret that he had not come home and told it a year ago when she was free was a small thing in comparison with the story itself. It could not outweigh the great gladness which that brought to her. It had, indeed, completely vanished from her thoughts her pride, which had never recovered from the blow which Harry Feversham had dealt to her in the hall at Lennon House, and by the man who had dealt the blow. She was aglow with it, and most grateful to Harry Feversham for that he had, at so much peril to himself, restored it. She was conscious of a new exhilaration in the sunlight, of a quicker pulsation in her blood. Her youth was given back to her upon that August afternoon. Ethne unlocked a drawer in her dressing case, and took from it the portrait which alone of all Harry Feversham's presents she had kept. She rejoiced that she had kept it. It was the portrait of someone who was dead to her, that she knew very well, for there was no thought of disloyalty towards Durrance in her breast. But the someone was a friend. She looked at it with a great happiness and contentment, because Harry Feversham had needed no expression of faith from her to inspire him, and no encouragement from her to keep him through the years on the level of his high inspiration. When she put it back again, she laid the white feather in the drawer with it, and locked the two things up together. She came back to her window. Out upon the lawn a light breeze made the shadows from the high trees dance. The sunlight mellowed and reddened. But Ethne was of her country, as Harry Feversham had long ago discovered, and her heart yearned for it at this moment. It was the month of August. The first of the heather would be out upon the hillsides of Donegal, and she wished that the good news had been brought to her there. The regret that it had not was not her crumpled rose leaf. Here she was in a strange land, There the brown mountains with their outcroppings of granite and the voices of the streams would have shared, she almost thought, in her new happiness. Great sorrows or great joys had this in common for Ethne Eustace. They both drew her homewards, since their endurance was more easy and gladness more complete. She had, however, one living tie with Donegal at her side, for Dermod's old collie dog had become her inseparable companion. To him she bade her confidence, and if at times her voice broke in tears, why the dog would not tell her. She came to understand much which Willoughby had omitted, and which Feversham had never told. Those 3 years of concealment in the small and crowded city of Suakin, for instance, with the troops marching out to battle and returning dust strewn and bleeding and laurelled with victory, Harry Feversham had to slink away at their approach, lest some old friend of his, Durrance perhaps, or Willoughby, or Trench, should notice him and penetrate his disguise. The panic which had beset him when first he saw the dark brown walls of Berber, the night in the ruined acres, the stumbling search for the well amongst the shifting sandhills of Obak. Ethne had vivid pictures of these incidents, and as she thought of each she asked herself, "Where was I then? What was I doing?" She sat in a golden mist until the lights began to change upon the still water of the creek, and the rooks reeled noisily out from the tree tops to sort themselves for the night, and warned her of evening. She brought to the dinner table that night a buoyancy of spirit which surprised her companions. Mrs. Adair had to admit that seldom had her eyes shone so starrily, or the colour so freshly graced her cheeks. She was more than ever certain that Captain Willoughby had brought stirring news. She was more than ever tortured by her vain effort to guess at its nature. But Mrs. Adair, in spite of her perplexities, took her share in the talk, and that dinner passed with a freedom from embarrassment unknown since Durrance had come home to Guessens, for he too threw off a burden of restraint. His spirits rose to match Ethne's. He answered laugh with laugh, and from his face that habitual look of tension, the look of a man listening with all his might that his ears might make good the loss of his eyes, passed altogether away. "You will play on your violin tonight, I think," he said with a smile, as they rose from the table. "Yes," she answered, "I will, with all my heart." Durrance laughed and held open the door. The violin remained locked in its case during these last 2 months. Durrance had come to look upon that violin as a gauge and test. If the world was going well with Ethne, the case was unlocked, the instrument was allowed to speak. If the world went ill, it was kept silent lest it should say too much, and open old wounds and lay them bare to other eyes. Ethne herself knew it for an indiscreet friend, but it was to be brought out tonight. Mrs. Adair lingered until Ethne was out of earshot. "You have noticed a change in her tonight?" she said. "Yes, have I not?" answered Durrance. "One has waited for it, hoped for it, despaired of it." "Are you so glad of the change?" Durrance threw back his head. "Do you wonder that I am glad, kind, friendly, unselfish? These things she has always been. But there is more than friendliness evident tonight, and for the first time it's evidence." There came a look of pity upon Mrs. Adair's face, and she passed out of the room without another word. Durrance looked at her. Durrance took all of that great change in Ethne to himself. Mrs. Adair drew up the blinds of the drawing room, opened the window, and let the moonlight in, and then, as she saw Ethne unlocking the case of her violin, she went out on to the terrace. She felt that she could not sit patiently in her company, so that when Durrance entered the drawing room he found Ethne alone there. She was seated in the window, and already tightening the strings of her violin. Durrance took a chair behind her in the shadows. "What shall I play for you?" she asked. "The Musoline Overture," he answered. "You played it on the first evening when I came to Ramelton. I remember so well how you played it then. Play it again tonight. I want to compare. I have played it since. Never to me." They were alone in the room. The window stood open. It was a night of moonlight. Ethne suddenly crossed to the lamp and put it out. She resumed her seat, while Durrance remained in the shadow, leaning forward with his hands upon his knees, listening, but with an intentness of which he had given no sign that evening. He was applying, as he thought, a final test upon which his life and hers should be decided. Ethne's violin would tell him assuredly whether he was right or no. Would friendship speak from it, or the something more than friendship? Ethne played the overture, and as she played she forgot that Durrance was in the room behind her. In the garden the air was still and summer warm and fragrant. On the creek the moonlight lay like a solid floor of silver. The trees stood dreaming to the stars. And as the music floated loud out across the silent lawn, Ethne had a sudden fancy that it might perhaps travel down the creek and over the Salcombe Bar and across the moonlit seas and strike small yet wonderfully clear like fairy music upon the ears of a man sleeping somewhere far away, beneath the brightness of the southern stars, with the cool night wind of the desert blowing upon his face. If he could only hear, she thought, if he could only wake and know that what he heard was a message of friendship. And with this fancy in her mind she played with such skill as she had never used before. She made of her violin a voice of sympathy. The fancy grew and changed as she played. The music became a bridge, swung in mid-air across the world, upon which, just for these few minutes, she and Harry Feversham might meet and shake hands. They would separate, of course, forthwith, and each one go upon the allotted way. But these few minutes would be a help to both along the separate ways. The chords rang upon silence. It seemed to Ethne they declaimed the pride which had come to her that day. Her fancy grew into a belief. It was no longer if he should hear, but he must hear. And so carried away was she from the discretion of thought that a strange hope suddenly sprang up and enthralled her. If he could answer! She lingered upon the last bars, waiting for the answer, and when the music had died down to silence, she sat with her violin upon her knees, looking eagerly out across the moonlit garden. And an answer did come, but it was not carried up the creek and across the lawn. It came from the dark shadow of the room behind her, and it was spoken through the voice of Durrance. "Ethne, where do you think I heard that overture last played?" Ethne was roused with a start to the consciousness that Durrance was in the room, and she answered like one shaken suddenly out of sleep. "Why, you told me at Ramelton, when you first came to Lennon House. I have heard it since, though it was not played by you. It was not really played at all, but a melody of it. Not even that really, but a suggestion of a melody. I heard stumble out upon a zither with many false notes, by a Greek in a bare little whitewashed café, lit by one glaring lamp at Wadi Halfa." "This overture," she said. "How strange." Not so strange after all, for the Greek was Harry Feversham. So the answer had come. Ethne had no doubt that it was an answer. She sat very still in the moonlight. Only had anyone bent over her with eyes to see, he would have discovered that her eyelids were closed. There followed a long silence. She did not consider why Durrance, having kept this knowledge secret so long, should speak of it now. She did not ask what Harry Feversham was doing, that he must play the zither in a mean café at Wadi Halfa. But it seemed to her that he had spoken to her as she to him. The music had, after all, been a bridge. It was not even strange that he had used Durrance's voice wherewith to speak to her. "When was this?" she asked at length. in February of this year. I will tell you about it." "Yes, please tell me." And Durrance spoke out of the shadows of the room. Chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gary Oldman. The answer to the overture. Ethne did not turn towards Durrance or move at all from her attitude. She sat with him, violin upon her knees, looking across the moonlight garden to the band of silver in the gap of the trees, and she kept her position deliberately, for it helped her to believe that Harry Feversham himself was speaking to her. She was able to forget that he was speaking through the voice of Durrance. She almost forgot that Durrance was even in the room. She listened with Durrance's own intentness, and anxious that the voice should speak very slowly, so that the message might take a long time in the telling, and she gathered it all jealously to her heart. "It was on the night before I started eastward into the desert for the last time," said Durrance, and the deep longing and regret with which he dwelt upon that last time for once left Ethne quite untouched. "Yes," she said, "that was in February, the middle of the month, wasn't it? Do you remember the day? I should like to know the exact day if you can tell me." "The 15th, said Durrance, and Ethne repeated the date meditatively. "I was at Glenalla all February," she said. "What was I doing on the 15th? It does not matter." She had felt a queer sort of surprise all the time when Willoughby was telling his story that morning, that she had not known, by some instinct, of these incidents at the actual moment of their occurrence. The surprise returned to her now. It was strange that she should have had to wait for this August night and this summer garden of moonlight and closed flowers before she learned of the meeting between Feversham and Durrance on February 15th, and heard the message. And the remorse came to her because of that delay. "It was my own fault," she said to herself. "If I had kept my faith in him, I should have known at once. I am well punished." It did not at all occur to her that the message could convey any but the best of news. It would carry on the good tidings which she had already heard. It would enlarge and complete, so that this day might be rounded to perfection. Of this she was quite sure. "Well," she said, "go on." "I have been busy all day in my office finishing up my work. I turned the key in the door at 10 o'clock. Thinking with relief that for 6 weeks I should not open it, and I strolled northward out of the Wadi Halfa along the Nile bank into the little town of Tewfikieh. As I entered the main street I saw a small crowd, Arabs, Negroes, a Greek or two, and some Egyptian soldiers standing outside the café, and lit up by a glare of light from within. As I came nearer I heard the sound of a violin and a zither, but most violently played, jingling out a waltz. I stood at the back of the crowd and looked over the shoulders of the men in front of me into the room. It was a place of 4 bare whitewashed walls. A bar stood in one corner. A wooden bench or two were ranged against the walls, and a single unshaded paraffin lamp swung and glared from the ceiling. A troupe of itinerant musicians were playing to that crowd of Negroes and Arabs and Egyptians for a night's lodging and the price of a meal. There were 4 of them, and, so far as I could see, all 4 were Greeks. 2 were evidently man and wife. They were both old, both slatternly, and almost in rags. The man a thin, sallow-faced fellow with grey hair and a black moustache. The woman fat, coarse of face, unwieldy of body. Of the other 2, one it seemed must be their daughter, a girl of 17, and not good looking really, but dressed and turned out with a scrupulous care, which in those sordid and mean surroundings lent her good looks. The care, indeed, with which she was dressed assured me she was their daughter, and to tell the truth, I was rather touched by the thought that the father and mother would go in rags so that she at all costs might be trim. A clean ribbon bound back her hair, an untorn frock of some white stuff clothed her tidily. Even her shoes were neat. The fourth was a young man. He was seated in the window with his back towards me, bending over his zither, but I could see that he wore a beard. When I came up, the old man was playing the violin, though playing it is not indeed the word. The noise he made was more like the squeaking of a pencil on a slate. It set one's teeth on edge. The violin itself seemed to squeal with pain, and while he fiddled and the young man hammered at his zither, the old woman and girl slowly revolved in a waltz. It may sound comic to hear about it, but if you could have seen, it fairly plucked at one's heart. I do not think that I have ever in my life witnessed anything quite so sad. The little crowd outside, negroes, mind you, laughing at the troupe, passing clumsy, heavy-footed, shining with heat, lumbering round slowly, panting with her exertions. The girl, lissom and young, the two men with their discordant, torturing music, and just above you the great planets and stars of an African sky, and just about you the great silent and spacious dignity of the moonlit desert. Imagine it. The very ineptness of the entertainment actually hurt one." He paused for a moment, while Ethne pictured to herself the scene which he had described. She saw Harry Feversham bending over his zither. And at once she asked herself, what was he doing with that troupe? It was intelligible enough that he would not care to return to England. It was certain that he would not come back to her, unless she sent for him. And she knew from what Captain Willoughby had said that he expected no message from her. He had not left with Willoughby the name of any place where a letter could reach him. But what was he doing at Wadi Halfa, masquerading with this itinerant troupe? He had money, so much Willoughby had told her. "You spoke to him?" she asked suddenly. "To whom?" "Oh, to Harry," returned Durrance. "Yes, afterwards, when I found out it was he who was playing the zither." "Yes, and how did you find out?" Ethne asked. The waltz came to an end. The old woman sank exhausted upon the bench against the whitewashed wall. The young man raised his head from his zither. The old man scraped a new chord upon his violin, and the girl stood forward to sing. Her voice had youth and freshness, but no other quality of music. Her singing was as inept as the rest of the entertainment. Yet the old man smiled. The mother beat time with her heavy foot, and nodded at her husband with pride in their daughter's accomplishments. And again in the throng, the ill-conditioned talk, the untranslatable jests of the Arabs and the negroes went their round. It was horrible, don't you think? "Yes," answered Ethne, but slowly, in an absent voice. As she had felt no sympathy for Durrance when he began to speak, so she had none to spare for these three outcasts of fortune. She was too absorbed in the mystery of Harry Feversham's presence at Wadi Halfa. She was listening too closely for the message which he sent to her, though through the open window the moon threw a broad panel of silver light upon the floor of the room close to her feet. She sat gazing into it as she listened, as though it was itself a window through which, if she looked but hard enough, she might see, very small and far away, that lighted café blazing upon the street of the little town of Tewfikieh on the frontier of the Soudan. "Well?" she asked, and after the song was ended, "The young man with his back towards me," Durrance resumed, "began to fumble out a solo upon the zither. He struck so many false notes, no tune was to be apprehended at first. The laughter and noise grew amongst the crowd, and I was just turning away, rather sick at heart, when some notes, a succession of notes, played correctly by chance, suddenly arrested me. I listened again, and a sort of haunting melody began to emerge. A weak, thin thing, with no soul in it. A ghost of a melody, and yet familiar. I stood listening in a street of sand, between the hovels fringed by a row of stunted trees, and I was carried away out of the east to Ramelton, and to a summer night beneath the melting sky of Donegal, when you sat by the open window, as you sit now, and played the Musoline overture, which you have played again tonight." "It was a melody from this overture?" she exclaimed. "Yes, and it was Harry Feversham who played the melody. I did not guess it at once. I was not very quick in those days." "But you are now," said Ethne. "Quicker. At all events, I should have guessed it now. Then, however, I was only curious. I wondered how it was that an itinerant Greek came to pick up the tune. At all events, I determined to reward him for his diligence. I thought that you would like me to." "Yes," said Ethne in a whisper. So, when he came out from the café, and with his hat in his hand passed through the jeering crowd, I threw a sovereign into the hat. He turned to me with a start of surprise. In spite of his beard, I knew him. Besides, before he could check himself, he cried out, "Jack!" "You can have made no mistake then," said Ethne in a wondering voice. "No, the man who strummed upon the zither was—" The Christian name was upon her lips, but she had the wit to catch it back unuttered. "Was Mr. Feversham. But he knew no music. I remember very well." She laughed with a momentary recollection of Feversham's utter inability to appreciate any music except that which she herself evoked from her violin. "He had no ear. You couldn't invent a discord harsh enough even to attract his attention. He could never have remembered any melody from the Musoline overture." "Yet it was Harry Feversham," he answered. "Somehow he had remembered. I can understand it. He would have so little he cared to remember, and that little he would have striven with all his might to bring clearly back to mind. Somehow, too, by much practice, I suppose, he had managed to elicit from his zither some sort of resemblance to what he remembered. Can't you imagine him working the scrap of music out in his brain, humming it over, whistling it uncounted times, with perpetual errors and confusions, until some fine day he got it safe and sure and fixed it in his thoughts? I can. Can't you imagine him, then, picking it out sedulously and laboriously on the strings? I can, indeed I can." Thus Ethne got her answer, and Durrance interpreted it to her understanding. She sat silent and very deeply moved by the story he had told to her. It was fitting that this overture, her favourite piece of music, should have conveyed the message that he had not forgotten her, that in spite of the fourth white feather he thought of her with friendship. Harry Feversham had not striven so laboriously to learn that melody in vain. Ethne was stirred as she had thought nothing would ever again have the power to stir her. He wondered whether Harry, as he sat in the little bare whitewashed café and strummed out his music to the negroes and Greeks and Arabs gathered about the window, had dreamed, as she had done tonight, that somehow, thin and feeble as it was, some echo of the melody might reach across the world. She knew not how, for very certain that, however much she might in the future pretend to forget Harry Feversham, it would never be more than a pretence. The vision of the lighted café in the desert town would never be very far from her thoughts. But she had no intention of relaxing on that account from her determination to pretend to forget. The mere knowledge that she had at one time been unjustly harsh to Harry made her yet more resolved that Durrance should not suffer for any fault of hers. "I told you last year, Ethne, at Hill Street," Durrance resumed, "that I never wished to see Feversham again. I was wrong. The reluctance was all on his side and not at all on mine. For the moment that he realized he had called out my name, he tried to edge backwards from me into the crowd. He began to gabble Greek, but I caught him by the arm, and I would not let him go. He had done you some great wrong, that I knew, but I could not remember it then. I only remembered that years before Harry Feversham had been my friend, my one great friend, that we had rowed in the same college boat at Oxford, he at Stoke, I at Seven, that the stripes on his jersey during 3 successive eights had made my eyes dizzy during those last 100 yards of spurt past the barges. We had bathed together in Sandford Lasher on summer afternoons. We had had supper on Kennington Island. We had cut lectures and paddled up the Cher to Islip. And here he was at Wadi Halfa, herding with that troop, an outcast sunk to such a depth of ill fortune that he must come to that squalid little town and play the zither vilely before a crowd of natives and a few Greek clerks for his night's lodging and the price of a meal. No, Ethne interrupted suddenly. It was not for that reason that he went to Wadi Halfa. Why then? Asked Durrance. I cannot think. But he was not in any need of money. His father had continued his allowance, and he had accepted it. You are sure? Quite sure. I heard it only today, said Ethne. It was a slip. But Ethne for once was off her guard that night. She did not even notice that she had made a slip. She was too engrossed in Durrance's story. Durrance himself, however, was not less preoccupied, and so the statement passed for the moment unobserved by either. So you never knew what brought Mr. Feversham to Haifa? She asked. Did you not ask him? Why didn't you? Why? She was disappointed, and the bitterness of her disappointment gave passion to her cry. Here was the last news of Harry Feversham, and it was brought to her incomplete, like the half sheet of a letter. The omission might never be repaired. I was a fool, said Durrance. There was almost as much regret in his voice now as there had been in hers, and because of that regret he did not remark the passion with which she had spoken. I shall not easily forgive myself. He was my friend, you see. I had him by the arm, and I let him go. I was a fool. And he knocked upon his forehead with his fist. He tried Arabic, Durrance resumed, pleading that he and his companions were just poor, peaceable people. That if I had given him too much money, I should take it back. And all the while he dragged away from me. But I held him fast. I said, Harry Feversham, that won't do. And upon that he gave in and spoke in English, whispering it. Let me go, Jack. Let me go. There was the crowd about us. It was evident that Harry had some reason for secrecy. It might have been shame, for all I knew, shame at his downfall. I said, come up to my quarters in Haifa as soon as you are free, and I let him go. All that night I waited for him on the veranda, but he did not come. In the morning I had to start across the desert. I only spoke of him to a friend who came to see me start. To Calder, in fact. You know of him? The man who sent you the telegrams, said Durrance with a laugh. Yes, I remember, Ethne answered. It was the second slip she had made that night. The receipt of Calder's telegram was just one of the things that Durrance was not to know. But again she was unaware that she had made a slip at all. She did not even consider how Durrance had come to know or guess that the telegram had ever been dispatched. At the very last moment, Durrance resumed, when my camel had risen from the ground, I stooped down to speak to him, to tell him to see Feversham. But I did not. You see, I knew nothing about his allowance. I merely thought that he had fallen rather low. It did not seem fair to him that another should know of it. So I rode on and kept silence. Ethne nodded her head. She could not but approve, however poignant her regret for the lost news. So you never saw Mr. Feversham again? I was away 9 weeks.
I came back blind," he answered simply, and the very simplicity of his words went to Ethne's heart. He was apologizing for his blindness, which had hindered him from inquiring. She began to wake to the comprehension that it was really Durrance who was speaking to her. But he continued to speak, and what he said drove her quite out of all caution. "I went at once to Cairo, and Calder came with me. There I told him of Harry Feversham, and how I had seen him at Tewfikieh. I asked Calder when he got back to Halfa to make inquiries, to find and help Harry Feversham, if he could. I asked him, too, to let me know the result. I received a letter from Calder a week ago, and I am troubled by it, very much troubled." "What did he say?" Ethne asked apprehensively, and she turned in her chair away from the moonlight towards the shadow of the room and Durrance. She bent forward to see his face, but the darkness hid it. A sudden fear struck through her and chilled her blood. But out of the darkness Durrance spoke. "That the two women and the old Greek had gone back northward on a steamer to Assouan." "Mr. Feversham remained at Wadi Halfa, then?" "That is so, isn't it?" she said eagerly. "No," Durrance replied. "Harry Feversham did not remain. He slipped past Halfa the day after I started towards the east. He went out in the morning and to the south." "Into the desert?" "Yes, but the desert to the south, the enemy's country. He went just as I saw him, carrying his zither. He was seen, there can be no doubt." Ethne was quite silent for a while. Then she asked, "You have that letter with you?" "Yes." "I should like to read it." She rose from her chair and walked across to Durrance. He took the letter from his pocket and gave it to her, and she carried it over to the window. The moonlight was strong. Ethne stood close to the window with a hand pressed upon her heart, and read it through once and again. The letter was explicit. The Greek who owned the café at which the troupe had performed admitted that Giuseppe, under which name he knew Feversham, had wandered south carrying a water skin and a store of dates, though why he either did not know or would not tell. Ethne had a question to ask, but it was some time before she could trust her lips to utter it distinctly and without faltering. "What will happen to him?" "At the best, capture. At the worst, death. Death by starvation or thirst, or at the hands of the Dervishes. But there is just a hope that it might be only capture and imprisonment. You see, he was white. If caught, his captors might think him a spy. They would be sure he had knowledge of our plans and our strength. I think that would most likely send him to Omdurman. I have written to Calder. Spies go out and in from Wadi Halfa. We often hear of things which happen in Omdurman. If Feversham is taken there, sooner or later I shall know. But he must have gone mad. It is the only explanation." Ethne had another, and she knew hers to be the right one. She was off her guard, and she spoke it aloud to Durrance. "Colonel Trench," she said, "is a prisoner at Omdurman." "Oh, yes," answered Durrance. "Feversham will not be quite alone. There is some comfort in that, and perhaps something may be done. When I hear from Calder, I will tell you. Perhaps something may be done." It was evident that Durrance had misconstrued her remark. He, at all events, was still in the dark as to the motive which had taken Feversham southward beyond the Egyptian patrols, and he must remain in the dark. For Ethne did not even now slacken in her determination still to pretend to have forgotten. She stood at the window with the letter clutched in her hand. She must utter no cry. She must not swoon. She must keep very still and quiet, and speak when needed with a quiet voice, even though she knew that Harry Feversham had gone southward to join Colonel Trench at Omdurman. But so much was beyond her strength, for as Colonel Durrance began to speak again, the desire to escape, to be alone with this terrible news, became irresistible. The cool quietude of the garden, the dark shadows of the trees, called to her. "Perhaps you will wonder," said Durrance, "why I have told you tonight what I have up to now kept to myself. I did not dare to tell it to you before. I want to explain why." Ethne did not notice the exultation in his voice. She did not consider what his explanation might be. She only felt that she could not now endure to listen to it. The mere sound of a human voice had become an unendurable thing. She hardly knew, indeed, that Durrance was speaking. She was only aware that a voice spoke and that the voice must stop. She was close by the window. A single silent step and she was across the sill and free. Durrance continued to speak out of the darkness, engrossed in what he said, and Ethne did not listen to a word. She gathered her skirts carefully so that they should not rustle, and stepped from the window. This was the third slip which she made upon that eventful night. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary Oldman. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Mrs. Adair interferes. Ethne had thought to escape quite unobserved, but Mrs. Adair was sitting upon the terrace in the shadow of the house, not very far from the open window of the drawing-room. She saw Ethne lightly cross the terrace and run down the steps into the garden, and she wondered at the precipitancy of her movements. Ethne seemed to be taking flight, and in a sort of desperation. The incident was singular, and remarkably singular to Mrs. Adair, who, from the angle in which she sat, commanded a view of that open window through which the moonlight shone. She had seen Ethne turn out the lamp, and the swift change in the room from light to dark, with its suggestion of secrecy and the private talk of lovers, had been a torture to her, but she had not fled from the torture. She had sat listening, and the music as it floated out upon the garden, with its thrill of happiness, its accent of yearning, and the low, hushed conversation which followed upon its cessation in that darkened room, had struck upon a chord of imagination in Mrs. Adair, and had kindled her jealousy into scorching flame. Then suddenly Ethne had taken flight. The possibility of a quarrel Mrs. Adair dismissed from her thoughts. She knew very well that Ethne was not of the kind which quarrels, nor would she escape by running away, should she be entangled in a quarrel. But something still more singular occurred. Durrance continued to speak in that room from which Ethne had escaped. The sound of his voice reached Mrs. Adair's ears, though she could not distinguish the words. It was clear to her that he believed Ethne to be still with him. Mrs. Adair rose from her seat and, walking silently upon the tips of her toes, came close to the open window. She heard Durrance laugh light-heartedly, and she listened to the words he spoke. She could hear them plainly now, though she could not see the man who spoke them. He sat in the shadows. "I began to find out," he was saying, "even on the first afternoon at Hill Street 2 months ago, that there was only friendship on your side. My blindness helped me. With your face and your eyes in view, I should have believed without question just what you wished me to believe. But you had no longer these defences. I, on my side, had grown quicker. I began, in a word, to see. For the first time in my life I began to see." Mrs. Adair did not move. Durrance, upon his side, appeared to expect no answer or acknowledgment. He spoke with the voice of enjoyment which a man uses recounting difficulties which have ceased to hamper him, perplexities which have been long since unravelled. "I should have definitely broken off our engagement, I suppose, at once, for I still believed, and as firmly as ever, that there must be more than friendship on both sides. But I had grown selfish. I warned you, Ethne. Selfishness was the blind man's particular fault. I waited and deferred the time of marriage. I made excuses. I led you to believe that there was a chance of recovery when I knew there was none. For I hoped, as a man will, that with time your friendship might grow into more than friendship. So long as there was a chance of that, I, Ethne, could not let you go. So I listened for some softness in your voice, some new buoyancy in your laughter, some new deep thrill of the heart in the music which you played, longing for it. How much? Well, tonight I have burnt my boats. I have admitted to you that I knew friendship limited your thoughts of me. I have owned to you that there is no hope my sight will be restored. I have even dared tonight to tell you what I have kept secret for so long, my meeting with Harry Feversham and the peril he has run. And why? Because for the first time I have heard tonight just those signs for which I waited. The new softness, the new pride in your voice, the buoyancy in your laughter. They have been audible to me all this evening. The restraint and the tension were gone from your manner, and when you played it was as though someone with just your skill and knowledge played, but someone who let her heart speak resonantly through the music as, until tonight, you have never done. Ethne, Ethne! But at that moment Ethne was in the little enclosed garden whither she had led Captain Willoughby that morning. Here she was private. Her collier dog had joined her. She had reached the solitude and the silence which had become necessities for her. Few more words from Durrance and her prudence would have broken beneath the strain. All that pretence of affection which during these last months she had so sedulously built up about him like a wall, which he was never to look over, would have been struck down and levelled to the ground. Durrance, indeed, had already looked over the wall, was looking over it with amazed eyes at this instant, but that Ethne did not know, and to hinder him from knowing it she had fled. The moonlight slept in silver upon the creek. The tall trees stood dreaming to the stars. The lapping of the tide against the bank was no louder than the music of a river. She sat down upon the bench and strove to gather some of the quietude of that summer night into her heart, and to learn from the growing things of nature about her something of their patience and their extraordinary perseverance. But the occurrence of the day had overtaxed her, and she could not. Only this morning, and in this very garden, the good news had come, and she had regained Harry Feversham. For in that way she thought of Willoughby's message. This morning she had regained him, and this evening the bad news had come and she had lost him, and most likely right to the very end of one's life. Harry Feversham meant to pay for his fault to the uttermost scruple, and Ethne cried out against his thoroughness, which he had learned from no one other than herself. Surely, she thought, he might have been content. In redeeming his honour in the eyes of one of the three he has done enough. He has redeemed it in the eyes of all. But he had gone south to join Colonel Trench in Omdurman. Of that squalid and shadowless town, of its hideous barbarities, of the horrors of its prison house, Ethne knew nothing at all. But Captain Willoughby had hinted enough to fill her imagination with terrors. He had offered to explain to her what captivity in Omdurman implied, and she wrung her hands as she remembered that she had refused to listen. What cruelties might not be practised, even now, at that very hour, perhaps, on this night of summer, but she dared not let her thoughts wander that way. The lapping of the tide against the banks was like the music of a river. It brought to Ethne's mind one particular river which had sung and babbled in her ears when 5 years ago she had watched out another summer night till dawn. Never had she so hungered for her own country and the companionship of its brown hills and streams. No, not even this afternoon, when she had sat at her window and watched the lights change upon the creek. Donegal held a sanctity for her. It seemed, when she dwelled in it, to set her in a way apart from and above earthly taints. And as her heart went out in a great longing towards it now, a sudden fierce loathing for the concealments, the shifts and manoeuvres which she had practised, and still must practise, sprang up within her. A great weariness came upon her too, but she did not change from her fixed resolve. Two lives were not to be spoilt because she lived in the world. Tomorrow she could gather up her strength and begin again, for Durrance must never know that there was another whom she placed before him in her thoughts. Meanwhile, however, Durrance, within the drawing-room, brought his confession to an end. "So you see," he said, "I could not speak of Harry Feversham until tonight, for I was afraid that what I had to tell you would hurt you very much. I was afraid that you still remembered him, in spite of those 5 years. I knew, of course, that you were my friend, but I doubted whether, in your heart, you were not more than that to him. Tonight, however, I could tell you without fear." Now, at all events, he expected an answer. Mrs. Adair, still standing by the window, heard a move in the shadows. "Ethne," he said, with some surprise in his voice. And since again no answer came, he rose and walked towards the chair in which Ethne had sat. Mrs. Adair could see him now. His hands felt for and grasped the back of the chair. He bent over it, as though he thought Ethne was leaning forward with her hands upon her knees. "Ethne," he said again, and there was in this iteration of her name more trouble and doubt than surprise. It seemed to Mrs. Adair that he dreaded to find her silently weeping. He was beginning to speculate whether, after all, he had been right in his inference from Ethne's recapture of her youth tonight, whether the shadow of Feversham did not, after all, fall between them. He leaned further forward, feeling with his hand, and suddenly a string of Ethne's violin twanged loud. She had left it lying on the chair, and his fingers had touched it. Durrance drew himself up straight and stood quite motionless and silent, like a man who had suffered a shock and is bewildered. He passed his hand across his forehead once or twice, and then, without calling upon Ethne again, he advanced to the open window. Mrs. Adair did not move, and she held her breath. There was just the width of the sill between them. The moonlight struck full upon Durrance, and she saw a comprehension gradually dawn in his face that someone was standing close to him. "Ethne," he said a third time, and now he appealed. He stretched out a hand timidly and touched her dress. "It is not Ethne," he said with a start. "No, it is not Ethne," Mrs. Adair answered quickly. Durrance drew back a step from the window, and for a little while was silent. "Where had she gone?" he asked at length. "Into the garden. She ran across the terrace and down the steps very quickly and silently. I saw her from my chair. Then I heard you speaking alone. Can you see her now in the garden?" "No. She went across the lawn towards the trees and their great shadows. There is only the moonlight in the garden now." Durrance stepped across the window sill and stood by the side of Mrs. Adair. The last slip which Ethne had made betrayed her inevitably to the man who had grown quick. There could be only one reason for her sudden, unexplained and secret flight. He had told her that Feversham had wandered south from Wadi Halfa into the savage country. He had spoken out his fears as to Feversham's fate without reserve, thinking that she had forgotten him, and indeed rather inclined to blame her for the callous indifference with which she received the news. The callousness was a mere mask, and she had fled because she no longer had the strength to hold it up before her face. His first suspicions had been right. Feversham still stood between Ethne and himself and held them at arm's length. "She ran as though she was in great trouble and hardly knew what she was doing," Mrs. Adair continued. "Did you cause the trouble?" "Yes." "I thought so, from what I heard you say." Mrs. Adair wanted to hurt, and in spite of Durrance's impenetrable face, she felt that she had succeeded. It was a small sort of compensation for the weeks of mortification which she had endured. There is something which might be said for Mrs. Adair. Extenuations might be pleaded, even if no defence was made, for she, like Ethne, was overtaxed that night. That calm, pale face of hers hid the quick passions of the South, and she had been racked by them to the limits of endurance. There had been something grotesque, something rather horrible, in the outbreak and confessions by Durrance, after Ethne had fled from the room. He was speaking out his heart to an empty chair. She herself stood without the window with a bitter longing that he had spoken so to her, and a bitter knowledge that he never would. She was sunk deep in humiliation. The irony of the position tortured her. It was like a jest of grim, selfish gods played off upon ineffectual mortals to their hurt. And at the bottom of all the thoughts rankled that memory of the extinguished lamp, and the low, hushed voices speaking one to the other in darkness. Therefore she spoke to give pain, and was glad that she gave it, even though it was to the man whom she coveted. "There's one thing which I don't understand," said Durrance. "I mean the change which we both noticed in Ethne tonight. I mistook the cause of it, that's evident. I was a fool, but there must have been a cause. The gift of laughter has been restored to her. Her gravity, her air of calculation had vanished. She became just what she was 5 years ago." "Exactly," Mrs. Adair answered. "Just what she was before Mr. Feversham disappeared from Ramelton." "You are so quick, Colonel Durrance. Ethne had good news of Mr. Feversham this morning." Durrance turned quickly towards her, and Mrs. Adair felt a pleasure at his abrupt movement. She had provoked the display of some emotion, and the display of emotion was preferable to his composure. "Are you quite sure?" he asked. "As sure as that you gave her the worst news tonight," she replied. But Durrance did not need the answer. Ethne had made another slip that evening, and though unnoticed at the time, it came back to Durrance's memory now. She had declared that Feversham still drew an allowance from his father. "I heard it only today," she had said. "Yes, Ethne heard news of Feversham today," he said slowly. "Did she make a mistake 5 years ago? There was some wrong thing Harry Feversham was supposed to have done. But was there really more misunderstanding than wrong? Did she misjudge him? Has she today learnt that she misjudged him? I will tell you what I know, and it is not very much. But I think it is fair that you should know it." "Wait a moment, please, Mrs. Adair," said Durrance sharply. He had put his questions rather to himself than to his companion, and he was not sure that he wished her to answer them. He walked abruptly away from her, and leaned upon the balustrade with his face towards the garden. It seemed to him rather treacherous to allow Mrs. Adair to disclose what Ethne herself evidently intended to conceal. But he knew why Ethne wished to conceal it. She wished him never to suspect that she retained any love for Harry Feversham. On the other hand, however, he did not falter from his own belief. Marriage between a man crippled like himself and a woman active and vigorous like Ethne could never be right unless both brought more than friendship. He turned back to Mrs. Adair. "I am no casuist," he said, "but here disloyalty seems the truest loyalty of all. Tell me what you know, Mrs. Adair. Something might be done perhaps for Feversham. From Assouan or Suakin, something might be done. This good news came, I suppose, this afternoon when I was at home." "No, this morning when you were here. It was brought by Captain Willoughby, who was once an officer in Mr. Feversham's regiment. He is now Deputy Governor of Suakin," said Durrance. "I know the man. For 3 years we were together in that town." "Well?" "He sailed down from Kingsbridge. You and Ethne were walking across the lawn when he landed from the creek. Ethne left you and went forward to meet him. I saw them meet because I happened to be looking out of this window at the moment." "Yes, Ethne went forward. There was a stranger whom she did not know. I remember. They spoke for a few moments, and then Ethne led him towards the trees at once, without looking back, as though she had forgotten," said Mrs. Adair. That little stab she had not been able to deny herself, but it evoked no sign of pain. "As though she had forgotten me, you mean," said Durrance, quietly completing her sentence. "No doubt she had." They went together into the little enclosed garden on the bank, and Durrance started as she spoke. "Yes, you followed them," continued Mrs. Adair curiously. She had been puzzled as to how Durrance had missed them. They were there then, he said slowly, on that seat in the enclosure all the while. Mrs. Adair waited for a more definite explanation of the mystery, but she got none. "Well?" he asked. "They stayed there for a long while. You had gone home across the fields before they came outside into the open. I was in the garden, and indeed happened to be actually upon the bank. So you saw Captain Willoughby. Perhaps you spoke to him?" "Yes, Ethne introduced him, but she would not let him stay. She hurried him into his boat and back to Kingsbridge at once." "Then, how did you know Captain Willoughby brought good news of Harry Feversham?" "Ethne told me that they had been talking of him. His manner and her laugh showed me no less clearly that the news was good." "Yes," said Durrance, and he nodded his head in assent. Captain Willoughby's tidings had begotten that new pride and buoyancy in Ethne which he had so readily taken to himself. Signs of the necessary something more than friendship, so he had accounted them. And he was right so far. But it was not he who had inspired them. His very penetration and insight had led him astray. He was silent for a few minutes, and Mrs. Adair searched his face in the moonlight for some evidence that he resented Ethne's secrecy. But she searched in vain. "And that is all?" said Durrance. "Not quite. Captain Willoughby brought a token from Mr. Feversham. Ethne carried it back to the house in her hand. Her eyes were upon it all the way. Her lips smiled at it. I do not think there is anything half so precious to her in all the world." "A token?" "A little white feather," said Mrs. Adair, "all soiled and speckled with dust. Can you read the riddle of that feather?" "Not yet," Durrance replied. He walked once or twice along the terrace and back, lost in thought. Then he went into the house and fetched his cap from the hall. He came back to Mrs. Adair. "It was kind of you to tell me this," he said. "I want you to add to your kindness. When I was in the drawing room alone, and you came to the window, how much did you hear? What were the first words?" Mrs. Adair's answer relieved him of a fear. Ethne had heard nothing whatever of his confession. "Yes," he said. "She moved to the window to read a letter by the moonlight. She must have escaped from the room the moment she had read it. Consequently, she did not hear that I had no longer any hope of recovering my sight, and that I merely used the pretence of a hope in order to delay our marriage. I am glad of that, very glad." He shook hands with Mrs. Adair and said good night. "You see," he added absently, "if I hear that Harry Feversham is in Omdurman, something might perhaps be done. From Suakin or Assouan, something might be done. Which way did Ethne go?" "Over to the water." "She had her dog with her, I hope?" "The dog followed her," said Mrs. Adair. "I am glad," said Durrance. He knew quite well what comfort the dog would be to Ethne in this bad hour, and perhaps he rather envied the dog. Mrs. Adair wondered that at a moment of such distress to him he could still spare a thought for so small an alleviation of Ethne's trouble. She watched him cross the garden to the stile in the hedge. He walked steadily forward upon the path like a man who sees. There was nothing in his gait or bearing to reveal that the one thing left to him had that evening been taken away. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Lewis. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Chapter 20, West and East. Durrance found his body servant waiting up for him when he had come across the fields to his own house of Guessens. "You can turn the lights out and go to bed," said Durrance, and he walked through the hall into his study. The name hardly described the room, for it had always been more of a gun-room than a study. He sat for some while in his chair, and then began to walk gently about the room in the dark. There were many cups and goblets scattered about the room, which Durrance had won in his past days. He knew them each one by their shape and position, and he drew a kind of comfort from the feel of them. He took them up one by one, and touched them, and fondled them, wondering whether, now that he was blind, they were kept as clean and bright as they used to be. This one, a thin-stemmed goblet, he had won in a regimental steeplechase at Colchester. He could remember the day, with its clouds and grey sky and the dull look of the ploughed fields between the hedges. That pewter, which stood upon his writing-desk and which had formed a convenient holder for his pens, when pens had been of use, he had acquired very long ago in his college fours when he was a freshman at Oxford. The hoof of a favourite horse mounted in silver made an ornament upon the mantelpiece. His trophies made the room a gigantic diary. He fingered his records of good days gone by, and came at last to his guns and rifles. He took them down from their racks. They were to him much what Ethne's violin was to her, and had stories for his ear alone. He sat with a Remington across his knees and lived over again one long hot day in the hills to the west of Berenice, during which he had stalked a lion across stony open country and killed him at 300 yards just before sunset. Another talked to him, too, of his first ibex shot in the Khor Baraka, and of antelope stalked in the mountains northward of Suakin. There was a little greener gun, which he had used upon midwinter nights in a boat upon this very creek of the Salcombe estuary. He had brought down his first mallard with that, and he lifted it and slid his left hand along the underside of the barrel, and felt the butt settle comfortably into the hollow of his shoulder. But his weapons began to talk over loudly in his ears, even as Ethne's violin in the earlier days, after Harry Feversham was gone and she was left alone, had spoken with too penetrating a note to her. As he handled the locks, and was aware that he could no longer see the sights, the sum of his losses was presented to him in a very definite and incontestable way. He put his guns away, and was seized suddenly with a desire to disregard his blindness, to pretend that it was no hindrance, and to pretend so hard that it should prove not to be one. The desire grew and shook him like a passion, and carried him winged out of the countries of dim stars straight to the east. The smell of the east, and its noises, and the domes of its mosques, the hot sun, the rabble in its streets, and the still blue sky overhead, caught at him till he was plucked from his chair and set pacing restlessly about his room. He dreamed himself to Port Said, and was marshalled in the long procession of steamers down the waterway of the canal. The song of the Arabs coaling the ships was in his ears, and so loud that he could see them as they went at night time up and down the planks between the barges and the deck, an endless chain of naked figures, monotonously chanting and lurid in the red glare of the braziers. He travelled out of the canal, past the red headlands of the Sinaitic Peninsula, into the chills of the Gulf of Suez. He zigzagged down the Red Sea, while the Great Bear swung northward, low down in the sky above the rail of the quarter-deck, and the Southern Cross began to blaze in the south. He touched at Tor and at Yambo. He saw the tall white houses of Yedda lift themselves out of the sea, and admired the dark brine-weathered woodwork of their carved casements. He walked through the dusk of its roofed bazaars with the joy of the homesick after long years come home. And from Yetta he crossed between the narrowing coral reefs into the landlocked harbour of Suakin. Westward from Suakin stretched the desert, with all that meant to this man whom it had smitten and cast out: the quiet padding of the camels' feet in sand, the great rock cones rising sheer and abrupt as from a rippleless ocean, towards which you march all day and get no nearer, the gorgeous momentary blaze of sunset colours in the west, the rustle of the wind through the short twilight, when the west is a pure pale green and the east the darkest blue, and the downward swoop of the planets out of nothing to the earth. The inheritor of the other places dreamed himself back into his inheritance as he tramped to and fro, forgetful of his blindness, and parched with desire as with a fever, until unexpectedly he heard the blackbirds and the swallows bustling and piping in the garden, and knew that outside his window the world was white with dawn. He waked from his dream at the homely sound. There were to be no more journeys for him. Affliction had caged him and soldered a chain about his leg. He felt his way by the balustrade up the stairs to his bed. He fell asleep as the sun rose. But at Dongola, on the great curve of the Nile, southwards of Wadi Halfa, the sun was already blazing, and its inhabitants were awake. There was sport prepared for them this morning under the few palm trees before the house of the Emir Wad el-Nejumi, a white prisoner captured a week before close to the wells of El Agia on the great Arbain road by a party of Arabs, had been brought in during the night, and now waited his fate at the Emir's hands. The news spread quick as a spark through the town. Already crowds of men and women and children flocked to this rare and pleasant spectacle. In front of the palm trees an open space stretched to the gateway of the Emir's house. Behind them a slope of sand descended flat and bare to the river. Harry Feversham was standing under the trees, guarded by 4 of the Ansar soldiery. His clothes had been stripped from him. He wore only a torn and ragged jebba upon his body and a twist of cotton on his head to shield him from the sun. His bare shoulders and arms were scorched and blistered. His ankles were fettered, his wrists were bound with a rope of palm fibre. An iron collar was locked about his neck, to which a chain was attached, and this chain one of the soldiers held. He stood and smiled at the mocking crowd about him, and seemed well pleased, like a lunatic. That was the character which he had assumed. If he could sustain it, if he could baffle his captors so that they were at a loss whether he was a man really daft, or an agent with promises of help and arms to the disaffected tribes of the Kordofan, then there was a chance that they might fear to dispose of him themselves and send him forward to Omdurman. But it was hard work. Inside the house the Emir and his councillors were debating his destiny. On the river bank and within his view a high gallows stood out black and most sinister against the yellow sand. Harry Feversham was very glad of the chain about his neck and the fetters on his legs. They helped him to betray no panic by assuring him of its futility. These hours of waiting, while the sun rose higher and higher and no one came from the gateway, were the worst he had ever as yet endured. All through that fortnight in Berber a hope of escape had sustained him, and when that lantern shone upon him from behind in the ruined acres, what had to be done must be done so quickly there was no time for fear or thought. Here there was time, and too much of it. He had time to anticipate and foresee. He felt his heart sinking till he was faint. just as in those distant days when he had heard the hounds scuffling and whining in a covert, and he himself had sat shaking upon his horse. He glanced furtively towards the gallows, and foresaw the vultures perched upon his shoulders, fluttering about his eyes. But the man had grown during his years of probation. The fear of physical suffering was not uppermost in his mind, nor even the fear that he would walk unmanfully to the high gallows, but a greater dread that if he died now, here at Dongola, Ethne would never take back that fourth feather, and his strong hope of the afterwards would never come to its fulfilment. He was very glad of the collar about his neck and the fetters on his legs. He summoned his wits together, and standing there alone, without a companion to share his miseries, laughed and scraped and grimaced at his tormentors. An old hag danced and gesticulated before him, singing the while a monotonous song. The gestures were pantomimic, and menaced him with abominable mutilations. The words described in simple and unexpurgated language the grievous death agonies which immediately awaited him, and the eternity of torture in hell which he would subsequently suffer. Feversham understood and inwardly shuddered, but he only imitated her gestures, and nodded and mowed at her as though she were singing to him of paradise. Others, taking their war trumpets, placed the mouths against the prisoner's ears and blew with all their might. "Do you hear, Kaffir?" cried a child, dancing with delight before him. "Do you hear our ombayas? Blow louder, blow louder!" But the prisoner only clapped his hands and cried out that the music was good. Finally there came to the group a tall warrior with a long heavy spear. A cry was raised at his approach, and a space was cleared. He stood before the captive and poised his spear, swinging it backwards and forward to make his arm supple before he thrust, like a bowler before he delivers a ball at a cricket match. Feversham glanced wildly about him, and, seeing no escape, suddenly flung out his breast to meet the blow. But the spear never reached him, for as the warrior lunged from the shoulder, one of the four guards jerked the neck chain violently from behind, and the prisoner was flung half-throttled upon his back. 3 times, and each time to a roar of delight, this pastime was repeated. And then a soldier appeared in the gateway of Nejumi's house. "Bring him in," he cried, and followed by the curses and threats of the crowd, the prisoner was dragged under the arch, across the courtyard, into a dark room. For a few moments Feversham could see nothing. Then his eyes began to adapt themselves to the gloom, and he distinguished a tall bearded man who sat upon an angarb, the native bedstead of the Soudan, and 2 others who squatted beside him on the ground. The man on the angarb was the Emir. "You are a spy of the government from Wadi Halfa," he said. "No, I am a musician," returned the prisoner, and he laughed happily like a man that has made a jest. Nejumi made a sign, and an instrument with many broken strings was handed to the captive. Feversham seated himself upon the ground, and with slow, fumbling fingers, breathing hard as he bent over the zither, he began to elicit a wavering melody. It was the melody to which Dorrance had listened in the streets of Tewfikieh on the eve of his last journey into the desert, and which Ethne Eustace had played only the night before in the quiet drawing-room at Southpool. It was the only melody which Feversham knew. When he had done, Nejumi began again. "You are a spy." "I have told you the truth," answered Feversham stubbornly, and Nejumi took a different tone. He called for food, and the raw liver of a camel, covered with salt and red pepper, was placed before Feversham. Seldom had a man had smaller inclination to eat, but Feversham ate none the less, even of that unattractive dish, knowing well that reluctance would be construed as fear, and that the signs of fear might condemn him to death. And while he ate, Nejumi questioned him in the silkiest voice about the fortifications of Cairo, and the strength of the garrison at Assuan, and the rumors of dissension between the Khedive and the Sidar. But to each question Feversham replied, "How should a Greek know of these matters?" Nejumi rose from his angareb and roughly gave an order. The soldiers seized upon Feversham and dragged him out again into the sunlight. They poured water upon the palm rope which bound his wrist, so that the thongs swelled and bit into his flesh. "Speak, Kaffir. You carry promises to the Kordofan." Feversham was silent. He clung doggedly to the plan over which he had so long and so carefully pondered. He could not improve upon it, he was sure, by any alteration suggested by fear at a moment when he could not think clearly. A rope was flung about his neck, and he was pushed and driven beneath the gallows. "Speak, Kaffir," said Nejumi. "So shall you escape death." Feversham smiled and grimaced and shook his head loosely from side to side. It was astonishing to him that he could do it, that he did not fall down upon his knees and beg for mercy. It was still more astonishing to him that he felt no temptation so to demean himself. He wondered whether the oft-repeated story was true that criminals in English prisons went quietly and with dignity to the scaffold because they had been drugged, for without drugs he seemed to be behaving with no less dignity himself. His heart was beating very fast, but it was with a sort of excitement. He did not even think of Ethne at that moment, and certainly the great dread that his strong hope would never be fulfilled did not trouble him at all. He had his allotted part to play, and he just played it, and that was all. Nejumi looked at him sourly for a moment. He turned to the men, who stood ready to draw away from Feversham the angareb on which he was placed. "Tomorrow," said he, "the Kaffir shall go to Omdurman." Feversham began to feel then that the rope of palm fibre tortured his wrist. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Lewis. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Chapter 21. Ethne Makes Another Slip. Mrs. Adair speculated with some uneasiness upon the consequences of the disclosures which she had made to Durrance. She was in doubt as to the course which he would take. It seemed possible that he might frankly tell Ethne of the mistake which he had made. He might admit that he had discovered the unreality of her affection for him, and the reality of her love for Feversham. And if he made that admission, however carefully he tried to conceal her share in his discovery, he would hardly succeed. She would have to face Ethne, and she dreaded the moment when her companion's frank eyes would rest quietly upon hers, and her lips demand an explanation. It was, consequently, a relief to her, at first, that no outward change was visible in the relations of Ethne and Durrance. They met and spoke as though that day on which Willoughby had landed at the garden, and the evening when Ethne had played the Musoline overture upon the violin, had been blotted from their experience. Miss Adair was relieved at first, but when the sense of personal danger passed from her, and she saw that her interference had been apparently without effect, she began to be puzzled. A little while, and she was both angry and disappointed. Durrance, indeed, quickly made up his mind. Ethne wished him not to know. It was some consolation to her in her distress to believe that she had brought happiness to this one man, whose friend she genuinely was. and of that consolation Durrance was aware. He saw no reason to destroy it for the present. He must know certainly whether a misunderstanding or an irreparable breach separated Ethne from Feversham before he took the steps he had in mind. He must have sure knowledge, too, of Harry Feversham's fate. Therefore he pretended to know nothing. He abandoned even his habit of attention and scrutiny, since for these there was no longer any need. He forced himself to a display of contentment. He made light of his misfortune, and professed to find in Ethne's company more than its compensation. "You see," he said to her, "one can get used to blindness and take it as a natural thing. But one does not get used to you, Ethne. Each time one meets you, one discovers something new and fresh to delight one. Besides, there is always the possibility of a cure." He had his reward, for Ethne understood that he had laid aside his suspicions, and she was able to set off his indefatigable cheerfulness against her own misery. And her misery was great. If for one day she had recaptured the lightness of heart which had been hers before the three white feathers came to Ramelton, she had now recaptured something of the grief which followed upon their coming. A difference there was, of course. Her pride was restored, and she had a faint hope, born of Durrance's words, that Harry after all might perhaps be rescued. But she knew again the long and sleepless nights and the dull hot misery of the head as she waited for the grey of the morning, for she could no longer pretend to herself that she looked upon Harry Feversham as a friend who was dead. He was living, and in what straits she dreaded to think, and yet thirsted to know. At rare times, indeed, her impatience got the better of her will. "I suppose that escape is possible from Omdurman," she said one day, constraining her voice to an accent of indifference. "Possible? Yes, I think so," Durrance answered cheerfully. "Of course it is difficult, and would in any case take time. Attempts, for instance, have been made to get Trench out and others, but the attempts have not yet succeeded. The difficulty is the go-between." Ethne looked quickly at Durrance. "The go-between?" she asked, and then she said, "I think I begin to understand," and pulled herself up abruptly. "You mean the Arab who can come and go between Omdurman and the Egyptian frontier?" "Yes, he is usually some dervish peddler or merchant trading with the tribes of the Sudan, who slips into Wadi Halfa or Assouan or Suakin and undertakes the work. Of course his risk is great. He would have short shrift in Omdurman if his business were detected. So it is not to be wondered at that he shrinks the danger at the last moment. As often as not, too, he is a rogue. You make your arrangements with him in Egypt, and hand him over the necessary money. In 6 months or a year he comes back alone with a story of excuses. It was summer, and the season unfavourable for an escape, or the prisoners were more strictly guarded, or he himself was suspected, and he needs more money. His tale may be true, and you give him more money, and he comes back again, and again he comes back alone." Ethne nodded her head. Exactly. Durrance had unconsciously explained to her a point which till now she had not understood. She was quite sure that Harry Feversham aimed in some way at bringing help to Colonel Trench, but in what way his own capture was to serve that aim she could not determine. Now she understood. He was to be his own go-between, and her hopes drew strength from this piece of new knowledge. For it was likely that he had laid his plans with care. He would be very anxious that the second feather should come back to her, and if he could fetch Trench safely out of Omdurman, he would not himself remain behind. Ethne was silent for a little while. They were sitting on the terrace, and the sunset was red upon the water of the creek. "Life would not be easy, I suppose, in the prison of Omdurman," she said, and again she forced herself to indifference. "Easy!" exclaimed Durrance. "No, it would not be easy. A hovel crowded with Arabs, without light or air, and the roof perhaps 2 feet above your head, into which you were locked up from sundown to morning. Very likely the prisoners would have to stand all night in that foul den, so closely packed would they be. Imagine it, even here in England, on an evening like this. Think what it would be like on an August night in the Sudan, especially if you had memories, say, of a place like this, to make the torture worse." Ethne looked out across that cool garden. At this very moment Harry Feversham might be struggling for breath in that dark and noisome hovel, dry of throat and fevered with the heat, with a vision before his eyes of the grass slopes of Ramelton, and with the music of the Lennon River liquid in his ears. "One would pray for death," said Ethne slowly, "unless—" she was on the point of adding, "unless one went there deliberately with a fixed thing to do," but she cut the sentence short. Durrance carried it on. "Unless there was a chance of escape," he said. "And there is a chance, if Feversham is in Omdurman." He was afraid that he had allowed himself to say too much about the horrors of the prison in Omdurman, and he added, "Of course what I have described to you is mere hearsay and not to be trusted. We have no knowledge. Prisoners may not have such bad times as we think." And thereupon he let the subject drop. Nor did Ethne mention it again. It occurred to her, at times, to wonder in what way Durrance had understood her abrupt disappearance from the drawing-room on the night when he had told her of his meeting with Harry Feversham. But he never referred to it himself, and she thought it wise to imitate his example. The noticeable change in his manner, the absence of that caution which had so distressed her, allayed her fears. It seemed that he had found for himself some perfectly simple and natural explanation. At times, too, she asked herself why Durrance had told her of that meeting in Wadi Halfa, and of Feversham's subsequent departure to the south. But for that she found an explanation, a strange explanation perhaps, but it was simple enough and satisfactory to her. She believed that the news was a message of which Durrance was only the instrument. It was meant for her ears and for her comprehension alone, and Durrance was bound to convey it to her by the will of a power above him. His real reason she had not stayed to hear. During the month of September, then, they had kept up the pretence. Every morning when Durrance was in Devonshire he would come across the field to Ethne at the pool, and Mrs. Adair, watching them as they talked and laughed without a shadow of embarrassment or estrangement, grew more angry, and found it more difficult to hold her peace and to let the pretence go on. It was a month of strain and tension to all three, and not one of them but experienced a great relief when Durrance visited his oculist in London, and those visits increased in number and lengthened in duration, and Ethne was grateful for them. She could throw off the mask for a little while. She had an opportunity to be tired. She had solitude wherein to gain strength to resume her high spirits upon Durrance's return. There came hours when despair seized hold of her. "Shall I be able to keep up the pretence when we are married, when we are always together?" she asked herself. But she thrust the question back unanswered. She dared not look forward, lest even now her strength should fail her. After the third visit Durrance said to her, "Do you remember that I once mentioned a famous oculist at Wiesbaden? It seems advisable that I should go to him." "You are recommended to go?" "Yes, and to go alone." Ethne looked up at him with a shrewd, quick glance. "You think that I should be dull at Wiesbaden," she said. "There is no fear of that. I can rout out some relative to go with me." "No, it's on my own account," answered Durrance. I shall perhaps have to go into a home. It's better to be quiet and to see no one for a time." "You are sure?" Ethne asked. "It would hurt me if I thought you proposed this plan because you felt I would be happier at Glenalla." "No, that is not the reason," Durrance answered, and he answered quite truthfully. He felt it necessary for both of them that they should separate. He, no less than Ethne, suffered under the tyranny of perpetual stimulation. It was only because he knew how much store she set upon carrying out her resolve that two lives should not be spoilt because of her, that he was able to hinder himself from crying out that he knew the truth. "I am returning to London next week," he added, "and when I come back I shall be in a position to tell you whether I am to go to Wiesbaden or not." Durrance had reason to be glad that he had mentioned his plan before the arrival of Calder's telegram from Wadi Halfa. Ethne was unable to connect his departure from her with the receipt of any news about Feversham. The telegram came one afternoon, and Durrance took it across to the pool in the evening and showed it to Ethne. There were only 4 words to the telegram: "Feversham imprisoned at Omdurman." Durrance, with one of his new instincts of delicacy which had been born in him lately by reason of his sufferings and the habit of thought, had moved away from Ethne's side as soon as he had given it to her, and had joined Mrs. Adair, who was reading a book in the drawing-room. He had folded up the telegram besides, so that by the time Ethne had unfolded it and saw the words, she was alone upon the terrace. She remembered what Durrance had said to her about the prison, and her imagination enlarged upon his words. The quiet of a September evening was upon the fields. A light mist arose from the creek and crept over the garden bank across the lawn. Already the prison doors were shut in that hot country at the junction of the Niles. "He is to pay for his fault 10 times over, then," she cried, in revolt against the disproportion. "And the fault was his father's, and mine too, more than his own, for neither of us understood." She blamed herself for the gift of that 4th feather. She leaned upon the stone balustrade, with her eyes shut, wondering whether Harry would outlive this night, whether he was still alive to outlive it. The very coolness of the stones on which her hands pressed became the bitterest of reproaches. "Something can now be done." Durrance was coming from the window of the drawing-room, and spoke as he came to warn her of his approach. "He was and is my friend. I cannot leave him there. I shall write tonight to Calder. Money will not be spared. He is my friend, Ethne. You will see. From Suakin or from Assouan something will be done." He put all the help to be offered to the credit of his own friendship. Ethne was not to believe that he imagined she had any further interest in Harry Feversham. She turned to him suddenly, almost interrupting him. "Major Castleton is dead?" she said. "Castleton?" he exclaimed. "There was a Castleton in Feversham's regiment. Is that the man?" "Yes. He is dead?" "He was killed at Tamai." "You are sure? Quite sure?" "He was within the square of the 2nd Brigade on the edge of the great gully when Osman Digma's men sprang out of the earth and broke through. I was in that square too. I saw Castleton killed." "I am glad," said Ethne. She spoke quite simply and distinctly. The 1st feather had been brought back by Captain Willoughby. It was just possible that Colonel Trench might bring back the 2nd. Harry Feversham had succeeded once under great difficulties in the face of great peril. The peril was greater now, the difficulties more arduous to overcome. That she clearly understood. But she took the one success as an augury that another might follow it. Feversham would have laid his plans with care. He had money wherewith to carry them out, and besides, she was a woman of strong faith. But she was relieved to know that the sender of the 3rd feather could never be approached. Moreover, she hated him, and there was an end of the matter. Durrance was startled. He was a soldier of a type not so rare as the maker of war stories wished their readers to believe. Hector of Troy was his ancestor. He was neither hysterical in his language nor vindictive in his acts. He was not an elderly schoolboy with a taste for loud talk, but a quiet man who did his work without noise, who could be stern when occasion needed, and of an unflinching severity, but whose nature was gentle and compassionate. And this barbaric utterance of Ethne Eustace he did not understand. "You dislike Major Castleton so much?" he exclaimed. "I never knew him. Yet you are glad that he is dead?" "I am quite glad," said Ethne stubbornly. She made another slip when she spoke thus of Major Castleton, and Durrance did not pass it by unnoticed. He remembered it, and thought it over in his gun room at Guessens. It added something to the explanation which he was building up of Harry Feversham's disgrace and disappearance. The story was gradually becoming clear to his sharpened wits. Captain Willoughby's visit and the token he had brought had given him the clue. A white feather could mean nothing but an accusation of cowardice. Durrance could not remember that he had ever detected any signs of cowardice in Harry Feversham, and the charge startled him perpetually into incredulity. But the fact remained. Something had happened on the night of the ball at Lennon House, and from that date Harry had been an outcast. Suppose that a white feather had been forwarded to Lennon House, and had been opened in Ethne's presence. Or more than one white feather. Ethne had come back from her long talk with Willoughby holding that white feather as though there was nothing so precious in all the world. So much Mrs. Adair had told him. It followed then that the cowardice was atoned, or in one particular atoned. Ethne's recapture of her youth pointed inevitably to that conclusion. She treasured the feather because it was no longer a symbol of cowardice, but a symbol of cowardice atoned. But Harry Feversham had not returned. He still slunk in the world's byways. Willoughby, then, was not the only man who had brought the accusation. There were others, two others. One of the two Durrance had long since identified. When Durrance had suggested that Harry might be taken to Omdurman, Ethne had at once replied, "Colonel Trench is in Omdurman." She needed no explanation of Harry's disappearance from Wadi Halfa into the southern Sudan. It was deliberate. He had gone out to be captured, to be taken to Omdurman. Moreover, Ethne had spoken of the untrustworthiness of the go-between, and there again had helped Durrance in his conjectures. There was some obligation upon Feversham to come to Trench's help. Suppose that Feversham had laid his plans of rescue and had ventured out into the desert that he might be his own go-between. It followed that a second feather had been sent to Ramelton, and that Trench had sent it. Tonight Durrance was able to join Major Castleton to Trench and Willoughby. Ethne's satisfaction at the death of a man whom she did not know could mean but the one thing. There would be the same obligation resting upon Feversham with regard to Major Castleton if he lived. It seemed likely that a third feather had come to Lennon House, and that Major Castleton had sent it. Durrance pondered over the solution of the problem, and more he found it plausible. There was one man who could have told him the truth, and who had refused to tell it, who would no doubt still refuse to tell it, but that one man's help Durrance intended to enlist, and to this end he must come with the story pat upon his lips and no request for information. "Yes," he said, "I think that after my next visit to London I can pay a visit to Lieutenant Sutch." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Lewis. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Chapter 22. Durrance lets his cigar go out. Captain Willoughby was known at his club for a bore. He was a determined raconteur of pointless stories about people with whom not one of his audience was acquainted, and there was no deterring him, for he did not listen, he only talked. He took the most savage snub with a vacant and amicable face, and wrapped in his own dull thoughts, he continued his copious monologue. In the smoking room or at the supper table he crushed conversation flat as a steamroller crushes a road. He was quite irresistible. Trite anecdotes were sandwiched between aphorisms of the copybook, and whether anecdotes or aphorisms, all was delivered with the air of a man surprised by his own profundity. If you waited long enough, you had no longer the willpower to run away. You sat caught in a web of sheer dullness. Only those, however, who did not know him waited long enough. The rest of his fellow members, at his appearance, straightway rose and fled. It happened, therefore, that within half an hour of his entrance to his club, he usually had one large corner of the room entirely to himself, and that particular corner, up to the moment of his entrance, had been the most frequented, for he made it a rule to choose the largest group as his audience. He was sitting in this solitary state one afternoon early in October, when the waiter approached him and handed to him a card. Captain Willoughby took it with alacrity, for he desired company, and his acquaintances had all left the club to fulfil the most pressing and imperative engagements. But as he read the card his countenance fell. "Colonel Durrance," he said, and scratched his head thoughtfully. Durrance had never in his life paid him a friendly visit before, and why should he go out of his way to do so now? It looked as if Durrance had somehow got wind of his journey to Kingsbridge. "Does Colonel Durrance know that I am in the club?" he asked. "Yes, sir," replied the waiter. "Very well, show him in." Durrance had, no doubt, come to ask questions, and diplomacy would be needed to elude them. Captain Willoughby had no mind to meddle any further in the affairs of Miss Ethne Eustace. Feversham and Durrance must fight their battle without his intervention. He did not distrust his powers of diplomacy, but he was not anxious to exert them in this particular case, and he looked suspiciously at Durrance as he entered the room. Durrance, however, had apparently no questions to ask. Willoughby rose from his chair and, crossing the room, guided his visitor over to his deserted corner. "Will you smoke?" he said, and checked himself. "I beg your pardon." "Oh, I'll smoke," Durrance answered. "It's not quite true that a man can't enjoy his tobacco without seeing the smoke of it. If I let my cigar go out, I should know at once. But you will see, I shall not let it out." He lighted his cigar with deliberation, and leaned back in his chair. "I am lucky to find you, Willoughby," he continued, "for I am only in town for to-day. I come up every now and then from Devonshire to see my oculist, and I was very anxious to meet you if I could. On my last visit, Mather told me that you were away in the country. You remember Mather, I suppose? He was with us in Suakin." "Of course, I remember him quite well," said Willoughby heartily. He was more than willing to talk about Mather. He had a hope that in talking about Mather, Durrance might forget that other matter which caused him anxiety. "We are both of us curious," Durrance continued, "and you can clear up the point we are curious about. Did you ever come across an Arab called Abou Fatma?" "Abou Fatma," said Willoughby slowly. "One of the Hatendoes?" "No, a man of the Kabbabish tribe." "Abou Fatma," Willoughby repeated, as though for the first time he had heard the name. "No, I never came across him," and then he stopped. It occurred to Durrance that this was not a natural place at which to stop. Willoughby might have been expected to add, "Why do you ask me?" or some question of the kind, but he kept silent. As a matter of fact, he was wondering how in the world Durrance had ever come to hear of Abou Fatma, whose name he himself had heard for the first and last time a year ago upon the veranda of the palace at Suakin. For he had spoken the truth. He had never come across Abou Fatma, although Feversham had spoken of him. "That makes me still more curious," Durrance continued. "Mather and I were together on the last reconnaissance in '84, and we found Abou Fatma hiding in the bushes by the Sinkat fort. He told us about the Gordon letters which he had hidden in Berber. Ah, you remember his name now." "I was merely getting my pipe out of my pocket," said Willoughby. "But I do remember that name now that you mention the letters. They were brought to you in Suakin 15 months or so back. Mather showed me the paragraph in the Evening Standard, and I am curious as to whether Abou Fatma returned to Berber and recovered them. But since you have never come across him, it follows that he was not the man." Captain Willoughby began to feel sorry that he had been in such haste to deny all acquaintance with Abou Fatma of the Kabbabish tribe. "No, it was not Abou Fatma," he said with an awkward sort of hesitation. He dreaded the next question which Durrance would put to him. He filled his pipe, pondered what answer he should make to it. But Durrance put no question at all for the moment. "I wonder," he said slowly. "I thought that Abou Fatma would hardly return to Berber. For indeed, whoever undertook the job undertook it at the risk of his life, and since Gordon was dead, for no very obvious reason." "Quite so," said Willoughby in a voice of relief. It seemed that Durrance's curiosity was satisfied with the knowledge that Abou Fatma had not recovered the letters. "Quite so. Since Gordon was dead, for no reason." "For no obvious reason, I think I said," Durrance remarked imperturbably. Willoughby turned and glanced suspiciously at his companion, wondering whether, after all, Durrance knew of his visit to Kingsbridge and its motive. Durrance, however, smoked his cigar, leaning back in his chair with his face tilted up towards the ceiling. He seemed, now that his curiosity was satisfied, to have lost interest in the history of the Gordon letters. At all events, he put no more questions upon that subject to embarrass Captain Willoughby, and indeed there was no need that he should. Thinking over the possible ways by which Harry Feversham might have redeemed himself in Willoughby's eyes from the charge of cowardice, Durrance could only hit upon this recovery of the letters from the ruined wall in Berber. There had been no personal danger to the inhabitants of Suakin since the days of that last reconnaissance. The great troop ships had steamed between the coral reefs towards Suez, and no cry for help had ever summoned them back. Willoughby risked only his health in that white palace on the Red Sea. There could not have been a moment when Feversham was in a position to say, "Your life was forfeit but for me, whom you call coward." And Durrance, turning over in his mind all the news and gossip which had come to him at Wadi Halfa, or during his furloughs, had been brought to conjecture whether that fugitive from Khartoum, who had told him his story in the glacis of the silent ruined fort of Sinkat during one drowsy afternoon of May, had not told it again at Suakin within Feversham's hearing. He was convinced now that his conjecture was correct. Willoughby's reticence was in itself a sufficient confirmation. Willoughby, without doubt, had been instructed by Ethne to keep his tongue in a leash. Colonel Durrance was prepared for reticence. He looked to reticence as the answer to his conjecture. His trained ear, besides, had warned him that Willoughby was uneasy at his visit and careful in his speech. There had been pauses, during which Durrance was as sure as though he had eyes wherewith to see that his companion was staring at him suspiciously, and wondering how much he knew, or how little. There had been an accent of wariness and caution in his voice, which was hatefully familiar to Durrance's ears, for just with that accent Ethne had been wont to speak. Moreover, Durrance had set traps. That remark of his, for no obvious reason, I think I said, had been one, and a little start here or a quick turn there showed him that Willoughby had tumbled into them. He had no wish, however, that Willoughby should ride off to Ethne and warn her that Durrance was making inquiries. That was a possibility he recognized, and he set himself to guard against it. "I want to tell you why I was anxious to meet you," he said. "It was because of Harry Feversham." And Captain Willoughby, who was congratulating himself that he was well out of an awkward position, fairly jumped in his seat. It was not Durrance's policy, however, to notice his companion's agitation, and he went on quickly. "Something happened to Feversham. It's more than 5 years ago now. He did something, I suppose, or left something undone. The secret, at all events, has been closely kept, and he dropped out, and his place knew him no more. Now you are going back to the Soudan, Willoughby?" "Yes," Willoughby answered, "in a week's time." "Well, Harry Feversham is in the Soudan," said Durrance, leaning towards his companion. "You know that?" exclaimed Willoughby. "Yes, for I came across him this spring at Wadi Halfa," Durrance continued. "He had fallen rather low." And he told Willoughby of their meeting outside of the cafe at Tewfikieh. "It's strange, isn't it? A man whom one knew very well going under like that in a second, disappearing before your eyes, as it were, dropping plumb out of sight as though down an oubliette in an old French castle. I want you to look out for him, Willoughby, and do what you can to set him on his legs again. Let me know if you chance on him. Harry Feversham was a friend of mine, one of my few real friends." "All right," said Willoughby cheerfully. Durrance knew at once from the tone of his voice that suspicion was quieted in him. "I will look out for Feversham. I remember he was a great friend of yours." He stretched out his hand toward the matches upon the table beside him. Durrance heard the scrape of the phosphorus and the flare of the match. Willoughby was lighting his pipe. It was a well-seasoned piece of briar, and needed a cleaning. It bubbled as he held the match to the tobacco and sucked at the mouthpiece. "Yes, a good friend," said Durrance. "You and I dined with him in his flat high up above St. James's Park just before we left England." At that chance utterance, Willoughby's briar pipe ceased suddenly to bubble. A moment's silence followed. Then Willoughby swore violently, and a second later he stamped upon the carpet. Durrance's imagination was kindled by this simple sequence of events, and he straightway made up a little picture in his mind. In one chair, himself smoking his cigar, a round table holding a match-stand on his left hand, and on the other side of the table Captain Willoughby in another chair. But Captain Willoughby lighting his pipe, and suddenly arrested in the act by a sentence spoken without significance. Captain Willoughby staring suspiciously in his slow-witted way at the blind man's face, until the lighted match, which he had forgotten, burned down to his fingers, and he swore and dropped it and stamped it out upon the floor. Durrance had never given a thought to that dinner till this moment. It was possible it might deserve much thought. "There were you and I and Feversham present," he went on. "Feversham had asked us there to tell us of his engagement to Miss Eustace. He had just come back from Dublin. That was almost the last we saw of him." He took a pull at his cigar and added, "By the way, there was a third man present." "Was there?" asked Willoughby. "It's so long ago." "Yes, Trench." "To be sure, Trench was present. It will be a long time, I am afraid, before we dine at the same table with poor old Trench again." The carelessness of his voice was well assumed. He leaned forward and struck another match and lighted his pipe. As he did so, Durrance laid down his cigar upon the table edge. "And we shall never dine with Castleton again," he said slowly. "Castleton wasn't there!" Willoughby exclaimed, and quickly enough to betray that, however long the interval since that little dinner in Feversham's rooms, it was at all events still distinct in his recollection. "No, but he was expected," said Durrance. "No, not even expected," corrected Willoughby. "He was dining elsewhere. He sent the telegram, you remember." "Ah, yes, a telegram came," said Durrance. The dinner party certainly deserved consideration. Willoughby, Trench, Castleton, these three men were the cause of Harry Feversham's disgrace and disappearance. Durrance tried to recollect all the details of the evening, but he had been occupied himself on that occasion. He remembered leaning against the window above St. James's Park. He remembered hearing the tattoo from the parade ground of Wellington Barracks, and a telegram had come. Durrance made up another picture in his mind. Harry Feversham at the table, reading and rereading his telegram. Trench and Willoughby waiting silently, perhaps expectantly, and himself paying no heed, but staring out from the bright room into the quiet and cool of the park. Castleton was dining with a big man from the War Office that night, Durrance said, and a little movement at his side warned him that he was getting hot in his search. He sat for a little while longer, talking about the prospects of the Soudan, and then he rose up from his chair. "Well, I can rely on you, Willoughby, to help Feversham if ever you find him. Draw on me for money." "I'll do my best," said Willoughby. "You are going?" "I could have won a bet off you this afternoon." "How?" "You said you did not let your cigar go out. This one's stone cold." "I forgot about it. I was thinking of Feversham. Good bye." He took a cab and drove away from the club door. Willoughby was glad to see the last of him, but he was fairly satisfied with his own exhibition of diplomacy. It would have been strange, after all, he thought, if he had not been able to hoodwink poor old Durrance. And he returned to the smoking room and refreshed himself with a whisky and potass. Durrance, however, had not been hoodwinked. The last perplexing question had been answered for him that afternoon. He remembered now that no mention had been made at the dinner which could identify the sender of the telegram. Feversham had read it without a word, and without a word had crumpled it up and tossed it into the fire. But to-day Willoughby had told him that it had come from Castleton, and Castleton had been dining with a high official of the War Office. The particular act of cowardice which had brought the three white feathers to Ramelton was easy to discern. Almost the next day Feversham had told Durrance in the Row that he had resigned his commission, and Durrance knew that he had not resigned it when the telegram came. The telegram could have brought only one piece of news, that Feversham's regiment was ordered on active service. The more Durrance reflected, the more certain he felt that he had at last hit upon the truth. Nothing could be more natural than that Castleton should telegraph his good news in confidence to his friends. Durrance had the story now complete, or rather the sequence of facts complete. For why Feversham should have been seized with panic, why he should have played the coward the moment after he was engaged to Ethne Eustace, at a time, in a word, when every manly quality he possessed should have been at its strongest and truest, remained for Durrance, and indeed was always to remain, an inexplicable problem. But he put that question aside, classing it among the considerations which he had learned to estimate as small and unimportant. The simple and true thing, the thing of real importance, emerged definite and clear. Harry Feversham was atoning for his one act of cowardice with a full and overflowing measure of atonement. "I shall astonish old Stutch," he thought, with a chuckle. He took the night mail into Devonshire the same evening, and reached his home before midday. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Derek Pohl. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Chapter 23. Mrs. Adair makes her apology. Within the drawing-room at the pool, Durrance said good-bye to Ethne. He had so arranged it that there should be little time for that leave-taking, and already the carriage stood at the steps of Gessens, with his luggage strapped upon the roof, and his servant waiting at the door. Ethne came out with him onto the terrace, where Mrs. Adair stood at the top of the flight of steps. Durrance held out his hand to her, but she turned to Ethne and said, "I want to speak to Colonel Durrance before he goes." "Very well," said Ethne. "Then we will say good-bye here," she added to Durrance. "You will write from Wiesbaden soon, please?" "The moment I arrive," answered Durrance. He descended the steps with Mrs. Adair, and left Ethne standing upon the terrace. The last scene of pretense had been acted out. The months of tension and surveillance had come to an end, and both were thankful for their release. Durrance showed that he was glad, even in the briskness of his walk, as he crossed the lawn at Mrs. Adair's side. She, however, lagged, and when she spoke, it was in a despondent voice. "So you're going," she said. "In 2 days' time you will be at Wiesbaden, and Ethne at Glenalla. We shall all be scattered. It will be lonely here." She had had her way. She had separated Ethne and Durrance for a time, at all events. She was no longer to be tortured by the sight of them, by the sound of their voices. But somehow her interference had brought her little satisfaction. "The house will seem very empty after you are all gone," she said. And she turned at Durrance's side and walked down with him into the garden. "We shall come back, no doubt," said Durrance, reassuringly. Mrs. Adair looked about her garden. The flowers were gone, and the sunlight. Clouds stretched across the sky overhead. The green of the grass underfoot was dull. The stream ran grey in the gap between the trees, and the leaves from the branches were blown russet and yellow about the lawns. "How long shall you stay at Wiesbaden?" she asked. "I can hardly tell, but as long as it's advisable," he answered. "That tells me nothing at all. I suppose it was meant not to tell me anything." Durrance did not answer her, and she resented his silence. She knew nothing whatever of his plans. She was unaware whether he meant to break his engagement with Ethne, or to hold her to it, and curiosity consumed her. It might be a very long time before she saw him again, and all that long time she must remain tortured with doubts. "You distrust me?" she said defiantly, and with a note of anger in her voice. Durrance answered her quite gently. "Have I no reason to distrust you? Why did you tell me of Captain Willoughby's coming? Why did you interfere?" "I thought you ought to know." "But Ethne wished the secret kept. I am glad to know, very glad. But, after all, you told me, and you were Ethne's friend." "Yours too, I hope," Mrs. Adair answered, and she exclaimed, "How could I go on keeping silence? Don't you understand?" No. Durrance might have understood, but he had never given much thought to Mrs. Adair, and she knew it. The knowledge rankled within her, and his simple "no" stung her beyond bearing. "I spoke brutally, didn't I?" she said. "I told you the truth as brutally as I could. Doesn't that help you to understand?" Again, Durrance said, "No." And the monosyllable exasperated her out of all prudence, and all at once she found herself speaking incoherently the things which she had thought, and once she had begun, she could not stop. She stood, as it were, outside of herself, and saw that her speech was madness, yet she went on with it. "I told you the truth brutally, on purpose. I was so stung because you would not see what was so visible had you only the mind to see. I wanted to hurt you. I am a bad, bad woman, I suppose. There were you and she in the room talking together in the darkness. There was I alone upon the terrace. It was the same again today. You and Ethne in the room. I alone upon the terrace. I wonder whether it will always be so. But you will not say. You will not say." She struck her hands together with a gesture of despair, but Durrance had no words for her. He walked silently along the garden path towards the stile, and he quickened his pace a little, so that Mrs. Adair had to walk fast to keep up with him. That quickening of the pace was a sort of answer, but Mrs. Adair was not deterred by it. Her madness had taken hold of her. "I do not think I would have minded so much," she continued, "if Ethne had really cared for you. But she never cared more than as a friend cares, just a mere friend. And what's friendship worth?" she asked scornfully. "Something, surely," said Durrance. "It does not prevent Ethne from shrinking from her friend," cried Mrs. Adair. "She shrinks from you, and shall I tell you why? Because you are blind. She is afraid, while I will tell you the truth, I am glad. When the news first came from Wadi Halfa that you were blind, I was glad. When I saw you in Hill Street, I was glad. Ever since I have been glad, quite glad, because I saw that she shrank. From the beginning she shrank, thinking how her life would be hampered and fettered." And the scorn of Mrs. Adair's voice increased, though her voice itself was sunk to a whisper. "I am not afraid," she said, and she repeated the words passionately again and again. "I am not afraid. I am not afraid." To Durrance, it seemed that in all his experience, nothing so horrible had ever occurred as this outburst by the woman who was Ethne's friend. Nothing so unforeseen. "Ethne wrote to you at Wadi Halfa out of pity," she went on. "That was all. She wrote out of pity, and, having written, she was afraid of what she had done. And being afraid, she had not courage to tell you she was afraid. You would not have blamed her if she had frankly admitted it. You would have remained her friend. But she had not the courage." Durrance knew that there was another explanation of Ethne's hesitations and timidities. He knew, too, that the other explanation was the true one. But tomorrow he himself would be gone from the Salcombe estuary, and Ethne would be on her way to the Irish Channel and Donegal. It was not worth while to argue against Mrs. Adair's slanders. Besides, he was close upon the stile which separated the garden of the pool from the fields. Once across that stile, he would be free of Mrs. Adair. He contented himself with saying quietly, "You are not just to Ethne." At that simple utterance, the madness of Mrs. Adair went from her. She recognized the futility of all that she had said, of her boastings of courage, of her detractions of Ethne. Her words might be true or not. They could achieve nothing. Durrance was always in the room with Ethne, never upon the terrace with Mrs. Adair. She became conscious of her degradation, and she fell to excuses. "I am a bad woman, I suppose. But after all, I have not had the happiest of lives. Perhaps there is something to be said for me." It sounded pitiful and weak, even in her ears. But they had reached the stile, and Durrance had turned towards her. She saw that his face lost something of its sternness. He was standing quietly, prepared now to listen to what she might wish to say. He remembered that in the old days, when he could see, he had always associated her with a dignity of carriage and a reticence of speech. It seemed hardly possible that it was the same woman who spoke to him now, and the violence of the contrast made him ready to believe that there must be, perhaps, something to be said on her behalf. "Will you tell me?" he said gently. "I was married almost straight from school. I was the merest girl. I knew nothing, and I was married to a man of whom I knew nothing. It was my mother's doing, and no doubt she thought that she was acting for the very best. She was securing for me a position of a kind, and comfort and release from any danger of poverty. I accepted what she said blindly, ignorantly. I could hardly have refused, indeed, for my mother was an imperious woman, and I was accustomed to obedience. I did as she told me, and married dutifully the man whom she chose. The case is common enough, no doubt, but its frequency does not make it easier of endurance." "But Mr. Adair," said Durrance. "After all, I knew him. He was older, no doubt, than you, but he was kind. I think, too, he cared for you." "Yes, he was kindness itself, and he cared for me. Both things are true. The knowledge that he did care for me was the one link, if you understand. At the beginning, I was contented, I suppose. I had a house in town, and another here, but it was dull." And she stretched out her arms. "Oh, how dull it was! Do you know the little back streets in a manufacturing town? Rows of small houses, side by side, with nothing to relieve them of their ugly regularity, each with the self-same windows, the self-same door, the self-same doorstep. Overhead, a drift of smoke, and every little green thing, down to the plants in the window, dirty and black. The sort of street whence any crazy religious charlatan who can promise a little color to their grey lives can get as many votaries as he wants. Well, when I thought over my life, one of those little streets always came into my mind. There are women, heaps of them no doubt, to whom the management of a big house, the season in London, the ordinary round of visits, are sufficient. I, worse luck, was not one of them. Dull. You, with your 100,000 things to do, cannot conceive how oppressively dull my life was. And that was not all." She hesitated, but she could not stop midway. and it was far too late for her to recover her ground. She went on to the end. I married, as I say, knowing nothing of the important things. I believed at the first that mine was just the allotted life of all women, but I began soon to have my doubts. I got to know that there was something more to be won out of existence than mere dullness. At least, that there is something more for others, though not for me. One could not help learning that. One passed a man and a woman riding together, and one chanced to look into the woman's face as one passed, or one saw, perhaps, the woman alone, and talked with her for a little while, and from the happiness of her looks and voice, one knew, with absolute certainty, that there was ever so much more. Only the chance of that ever so much more my mother had denied to me. All the sternness had now gone from Durrance's face, and Mrs. Adair was speaking with a great simplicity. Of the violence which she had used before, there was no longer any trace. She did not appeal for pity. She was not even excusing herself. She was just telling her story, quietly and gently. And then you came, she continued. I met you, and met you again. You went away upon your duties, and you returned. And I learnt now, not that there was ever so much more, but just what that ever so much more was. But it was still, of course, denied to me. However, in spite of that, I felt happier. I thought that I should be quite content to have you for a friend, to watch your progress, and to feel pride in it. But you see, Ethne came too, and you turned to her. At once. Oh, at once. If you'd only been a little less quick to turn to her. In a very short while, I was sad and sorry that you had ever come into my life. I knew nothing of this, said Durrance. I never suspected. I'm sorry. I took care you should not suspect, said Mrs. Adair. But I tried to keep you. With all my wits I tried. No matchmaker in the world ever worked so hard to bring two people together as I did to bring together Ethne and Mr. Feversham. And I succeeded. The statement came upon Durrance with a shock. He leaned back against the stile and could have laughed. Here was the origin of the whole sad business. From what small beginnings it had grown. It is a trite reflection, but the personal application of it is apt to take away the breath. It was so with Durrance, as he thought himself backwards into those days when he had walked on his own path, heedless of the people with whom he came in touch, never dreaming that they were, at that moment, influencing his life right up to his dying day. Feversham's disgrace and ruin, Ethne's years of unhappiness, the wearying pretenses of the last few months, all had their origin years ago when Mrs. Adair, to keep Durrance to herself, threw Feversham and Ethne into each other's company. I succeeded, continued Mrs. Adair. You told me that I had succeeded one morning in the Row. How glad I was. You did not notice it, I'm sure. The next moment, you took all my gladness from me by telling me you were starting for the Sudan. You were away 3 years. They were not happy years for me. You came back. My husband was dead, but Ethne was free. Ethne refused you, but you went blind, and she claimed you. You can see what ups and downs have fallen to me, but these months here have been the worst. "I am very sorry," said Durrance. Mrs. Adair was quite right, he thought. There was indeed something to be said on her behalf. The world had gone rather hardly with her. He was able to realize what she had suffered, since he was suffering in much the same way himself. It was quite intelligible to him why she had betrayed Ethne's secret that night upon the terrace, and he could not but be gentle with her. "I am very sorry, Mrs. Adair," he repeated lamely. There was nothing more which he could find to say, and he held out his hand to her. "Goodbye," she said, and Durrance climbed over the stile and crossed the fields to his house. Mrs. Adair stood by that stile for a long while after he had gone. She had shot her bolt, and hit no one but herself and the man for whom she cared. She realized that distinctly. She looked forward a little, too, and she understood that if Durrance did not, after all, keep Ethne to her promise, and marry her, and go with her to her country, he would come back to Guessens. That reflection showed Mrs. Adair yet more clearly the folly of her outcry. If she had only kept silence, she would have had a very true and constant friend for her neighbor, and that would have been something. It would have been a good deal. But since she had spoken, they could never meet without embarrassment. And practice cordiality as they might, there would always remain in their minds the recollection of what she had said and he had listened to on the afternoon when he left for Wiesbaden. End of chapter 23. Recording by Derek Pohl, Vancouver, BC, Canada, December 2011.
Chapter 24 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Chapter 24. On the Nile. It was a callous country inhabited by a callous race, thought Calder, as he traveled down the Nile from the Wadi Halfa to Aswan on his 3 months' furlough. He leaned over the rail of the upper deck of the steamer and looked down upon the barge lashed alongside. On the lower deck of the barge, among the native passengers, stood an angareb, the native bedstead of matting woven across a four-legged frame, whereon was stretched the motionless figure of a human being shrouded in a black veil. The angareb and its burden had been carried on board early that morning at Korosko by 2 Arabs, who now sat laughing and chattering in the stern of the barge. It might have been a dead man or a dead woman who lay still and stretched upon the bedstead. So little heed did they give to it. Calder lifted his eyes and looked to his right and his left across glaring sand and barren rocks shaped roughly into the hard forms of pyramids. The narrow, meager strip of green close by the water's edge upon each bank was the only response which the Sudan made to spring and summer and the beneficent rain. A callous country inhabited by a callous people. Calder looked downwards again to the angareb upon the barge's deck and the figure lying upon it. Whether it was man or woman he could not tell. The black veil lay close about the face, outlining the nose, the hollows of the eyes, and the mouth. But whether the lips wore a moustache and the chin a beard, it did not reveal. The slanting sunlight crept nearer and nearer to the angareb. The native seated close to it moved into the shadow of the upper deck, but no one moved the angareb, and the two men laughing in the stern gave no thought to their charge. Calder watched the blaze of yellow light creep over the black, recumbent figure from the feet upwards. It burnt at last, bright and pitiless, upon the face. Yet the living creature beneath the veil never stirred. The veil never fluttered above the lips. The legs remained stretched out straight. The arms lay close against the side. Calder shouted to the two men in the stern. "Move the angareb into the shadow," he cried, "and be quick." The Arabs rose reluctantly and obeyed him. "Is it a man or woman?" asked Calder. "A man. We are taking him to the hospital at Aswan, but we do not think that he will live. He fell from a palm tree 3 weeks ago." "You give him nothing to eat or drink?" "He is too ill." It was a common story, and the logical outcome of the belief that life and death are written, and will inevitably befall after the manner of the writing. The man lying so quiet beneath the black covering had probably at the beginning suffered nothing more serious than a bruise, which a few simple remedies would have cured within a week. But he had been allowed to lie, even as he lay upon the angareb, at the mercy of the sun and the flies, unwashed, unfed, and with his thirst unslacked. The bruise had become a sore, the sore had gangrened, and when all remedies were too late, the Egyptian Mudir of Korosko had discovered the accident and sent the man on the steamer down to Aswan. But familiar though the story was, Calder could not dismiss it from his thoughts. The immobility of the sick man upon the native bedstead in a way fascinated him, and when towards sunset a strong wind sprang up and blew against the stream, he felt an actual comfort in the knowledge that the sick man would gain some relief from it. And when his neighbor that evening at the dinner table spoke to him with a German accent, he suddenly asked, upon an impulse, "You are not a doctor by any chance?" "Not a doctor," said the German, "but a student of medicine at Bonn. I came from Cairo to see the second cataract, but was not allowed to go farther than Wadi Halfa." Calder interrupted him at once. "Then I will trespass upon your holiday and claim your professional assistance." "For yourself? With pleasure, though I should never have guessed you were ill," said the student, smiling good-naturedly behind his eyeglasses. "Nor am I. It is an Arab for whom I ask your help." "The man on the bedstead?" "Yes. If you will be so good, I will warn you, he was hurt 3 weeks ago, and I know these people. No one will have touched him since he was hurt. The sight will not be pretty. This is not a nice country for untended wounds." The German student shrugged his shoulders. "All experience is good," said he, and the two men rose from the table and went out on to the upper deck. The wind had freshened during the dinner, and blowing upstream had raised waves so that the steamer and its barge tossed, and the water broke on board. "He was below there," said the student, as he leaned over the rail and peered downwards to the lower deck of the barge alongside. It was night, and the night was dark. Above that lower deck only one lamp swung from the center of the upper deck, glimmered and threw uncertain lights and uncertain shadows over a small circle. Beyond the circle all was black darkness, except at the bows, where the water breaking on board flung a white sheet of spray. It could be seen like a sprinkle of snow driven by the wind. It could be heard striking the deck like the lash of a whip. "He has been moved," said the German. "No doubt he has been moved. There is no one in the bows." Calder bent his head downwards and stared into the darkness for a little while without speaking. "I believe the angareb is there," he said at length. "I believe it is." Followed by the German, he hurried down the stairway to the lower deck of the steamer and went to the side. He could make certain now. The angareb stood in a wash of water on the very spot to which, at Calder's order, It had been moved that morning, and on the angareb the figure beneath the black covering lay as motionless as ever, as inexpressive of life and feeling, though the cold spray broke continually upon his face. "I thought it would be so," said Calder. He got a lantern and with the German student climbed across the bulwarks onto the barge. He summoned the two Arabs. "Move the angareb from the bow," he said. And when they had obeyed, "Now take that covering off. I wish my friend who is a doctor to see the wound." The two men hesitated, and then one of them with an air of insolence objected. "There are doctors in Aswan, whither we are taking him." Calder raised the lantern and himself drew the veil away from off the wounded man. "Now, if you please," he said to his companion. The German student made his examination of the wounded thigh, while Calder held the lantern above his head. As Calder had predicted, it was not a pleasant business, for the wound crawled. The German student was glad to cover it up again. "I can do nothing," he said. "Perhaps in a hospital, with baths and dressings, relief will be given at all events, but more, I do not know. Here I could not even begin to do anything at all. Do these two men understand English?" "No," answered Calder. "Then I can tell you something. He did not get hurt by falling out of any palm tree. That is a lie. The injury was done by the blade of a spear or some weapon of the kind." "Are you sure?" "Yes." Calder bent down suddenly toward the Arab on the angareb. Although he never moved, the man was conscious. Calder had been looking steadily at him, and he saw that his eyes followed the spoken words. "You understand English?" said Calder. The Arab could not answer with his lips, but a look of comprehension came into his face. "Where do you come from?" asked Calder. The lips tried to move, but not so much as a whisper escaped from them. Yet his eyes spoke, but spoke vainly, for the most which they could tell was a great eagerness to answer. Calder dropped upon his knee, close by the man's head, and holding the lantern close, enunciated the towns. "From Dongola?" No gleam in the Arab's eye responded to that name. "From Metemna? From Berber? From Omdurman?" "Ah!" The Arab answered to that word. He closed his eyelids. Calder went on still more eagerly. "You were wounded there?" "No." "Where then? At Berber?" "Yes." "You were in prison at Omdurman and escaped?" "No." "Yet you were wounded." Calder sank back upon his knee and reflected. His reflections roused in him some excitement. He bent down to the Arab's ear and spoke in a lower key. "You were helping someone to escape?" "Yes." "Who? El-Kamakam trench?" "No." He mentioned the names of other white captives in Omdurman, and to each name the Arab's eyes answered no. "It was Effendi Feversham then," he said, and the eyes assented as clearly as though the lips had spoken. But this was all the information which Calder could secure. "I too am pledged to help Effendi Feversham," he said, but in vain. The Arab could not speak. He could not so much as tell his name, and his two companions would not. Whatever those two men knew or suspected, they had no mind to meddle in the matter themselves, and they clung consistently to a story which absolved them from responsibility. Kinsmen of theirs in Korosko, hearing that they were traveling to Aswan, had asked them to take charge of the wounded man, who was a stranger to them, and they had consented. Calder could get nothing more explicit from them than this statement, however closely he questioned them. He had under his hand the information which he desired, the news of Harry Feversham, for which Durrance asked by every mail. but it was hidden from him in a locked book. He stood beside the helpless man upon the angareb. There he was, eager enough to speak, but the extremity of weakness to which he had sunk laid a finger upon his lips. All that Calder could do was to see him safely bestowed within the hospital at Aswan. "Will he recover?" Calder asked, and the doctors shook their heads in doubt. There was a chance, perhaps, a very slight chance, but at the best recovery would be slow. Calder continued upon his journey to Cairo and Europe. An opportunity of helping Harry Feversham had slipped away, for the Arab who could not even speak his name was Abdu Fatma of the Kababish tribe, and his presence, wounded and helpless upon the Nile steamer between Korosko and Aswan, meant that Harry Feversham's carefully laid plan for the rescue of Colonel Trench had failed. End of chapter 24.